Halo 2 was truly a massive game in scale and in size. Bungie essentially wanted it to be the final Halo, but in an insane crunch to get the game to meet its 2004 release date, tons of content had to be scrapped, repurposed, or never even attempted during development. In this video, I'm basically going to cover most of the cut content of Halo 2 that I can personally dig up and find. I'm sure there'll be plenty of other things that were cut from Halo 2 that I'll miss in this video, but I still want to cover at least a lot, if not most, of the lost content that we never got to see in Halo 2 that I felt was worth mentioning. So, let's get into it. Overall, this is the exploration of the lost and cut content for Halo 2. Now for a quick disclaimer, I'm going to be covering a lot of this cut content for Halo 2 in mostly sections or parts, just because of the scale of how massive this whole thing is. So the first chunk we're going to go over is levels. The first bit of lost levels to Halo 2 are actually something called the Milestone 1 levels. Now these levels are actually very early levels and demo environments made by Bungie in the 2002 to 2003 period of development, mainly using the Halo 1.5 engine or the BLAM engine in the transition period with when the engine was being upgraded and retooled for Halo 2. The reason they are called the Milestone 1 levels are mainly because the levels represented the first milestone completion in Halo 2's development. They are basically just meant to show off many of the physics, gameplay, and how the later planned levels would need to proceed based on the feedback that was collected from these demo environments. Think of them as essentially glorified demo levels, if you will. Now, in E3 2003 and also in the period in 2002, these levels were shown to some very lucky members of the gaming press behind closed doors. But after this, we never really heard anything about these levels again, and most assumed they were just lost. Until just recently, a while back, the DigSite team was able to retrieve these levels and release them to the public through the MCC Steam Workshop, which is overall just really awesome. Now, there were actually 3 Milestone 1 maps actually created. The first of these was a level called Defensive, which was basically a sprawling Halo CE style of map where basically you were on an island trying to defend a UNSC starship from Covenant forces. And overall, for my personal opinion of it, I think it's pretty cool. I like the sprawling hills and the terrain. I think some of the nice model work and the prototype models and the textures look pretty nice, but overall it obviously looks pretty unfinished and pretty bare bones. Still though, it's a pretty cool demo level. The next milestone level was actually a level called Exploration, which was basically a giant level on the moon essentially. You're basically in a zero-G environment and you can take out enemies using many of the physics across large and bumpy terrain on the moon. You would then enter a Forerunner installation and eventually go battle through corridors of Covenant forces until eventually reactivating the Forerunner installation and escaping, essentially being this cool little demo environment. Many assumed it was actually a lost campaign level, but sadly it was really not the case. It was mostly used as a sandbox demo-like level for the Cairo Station one that we got in the final game, just to test out all the physics in the zero-G environment. And during the brief development of this Milestone 1 level, it actually went through many different names, like the Final Moon, Moonbase, but obviously now the final name for it is Exploration, but many people know it by Moonbase today as well. And for my overall thoughts on this level, I think it's definitely the best of the Milestone 1 levels, and I think it has the most interesting environment, the best gameplay, the best mission, and overall feels the most completed. The third and final milestone level was a level called Assault, which was basically a giant sprawling level on the Halo ring with a massive Forerunner installation on a mountain. You can basically explore all around using the Warthog or maybe some mods or skulls. A pretty cool feature of this map was originally supposed to be the introduction of the stealth system that Bungie was intending to use in Halo 2. This map was basically going to be a staging ground for all of the mechanics that the stealth system was going to incorporate. It even featured an elaborate alert ranking system with different color alerts representing various levels of attack to the player and alertness from the enemy. It also would have made use of the elaborate stencil shadows and other lighting effects also to contribute to this lost stealth system that was cut from the Halo 2 and never made it to the final game. And overall, I think that the Milestone 1 levels are still really cool. I think they're a great artifact of Halo 2's development and really shows the scale and ambition Bungie was really going for in this original version of Halo 2. And the fact that we were able to finally play them is really cool and a nice bit of recovered lost media. Now moving on to other cut levels from Halo 2. And this time around, this includes a variety of campaign missions intended to be a part of the original game. Most of these levels were at various stages of development before being cut. I did mention a few of them in my Lost Story video, but I still want to explore them more in depth here and give more of a detailed explanation of what these original Lost campaign levels actually are. Alpha Moon was a cut campaign level in Halo 2. It was essentially an alternate version of the Oracle level from the final game, but with some major big differences. The setting of this level would have been on a moon called Basis, which would have been orbiting the gas giant Threshold, which was obviously the setting that we got for this mission in the final game. The setting of this map would have been essentially set in a heretic camp, and the story of this mission would have essentially been the same as the Oracle section in the final game of Halo 2. But I'm assuming it would have included more parts from the original story of Halo 2, like that original scene where Tartarus would have showed up and took out the heretic leader instead of the Arbiter doing so in the final game. Also, when this campaign level was in development, this was when the Arbiter was still called the Dervish, which was basically the original version of the Arbiter and the behind the scenes making of this level. Some cool aspects of this level would have included the fact that we would have been in the ruins of Alpha Halo from Halo Combat Evolved in the setting for this mission, with a pretty cool scene with a fight happening in the wrecked control room from the first game. Also, the level would have had tons of wreckage from the ring on the moon scattering the level. One of the primary objectives in this level, besides playing out similarly to the Oracle level and narrative in the final game, was actually going to take out a Zolt pattern Weevil cannon at some point in the mission. This cannon was featured pretty heavily in the E3 demo for Halo 2, and was one of those lost vehicles and platforms that we never got to see in the final game. Eventually though, this level got cut. It seemed it got cut mainly due to the massive scale and scope of this level and its original vision, and sadly in the rush to get Halo 2 out, it was cut into development. And also it seemed that the original hardware of the Xbox just could not support a scale and the scope of this original massive level. Described by engineering lead at Bungie about the level Alpha Moon after the fact, we were building stuff that just couldn't be played, in any engine we built and detailed. And we went a huge way down the path with a whole bunch of environments and levels for the game that just totally didn't make it. If you look at the level with the flood inside the quarantine area, that is the remaining 20% of the gargantuan sprawling level that was meticulously built and hand constructed, but that could never ever have shipped in any engine. Regardless though, this level has been known to be lost for a long time, before surprisingly reappearing in a live stream with Frank O'Connor where he was basically using an old Halo 2 dev kit and basically found the level and played it on stream. So it seems like some version of it is still existing in the real world. The build of the level was essentially using an old Halo CE engine. It had the old hub from the first game, but most of the enemy in the level and assets were actually from Halo 2, and it also ran at a very low frame rate as it was not optimized for the Xbox at the time. Before scrapping the level, there were actually brief considerations of making the level a demo for the game, but soon at least 20% of the geometry from the level was eventually used for Sacred Icon and the Quarantine Zone in the final game, with some of the geometry also making it into a prototype of a theater mode for Halo 2 as well, before also that mode getting cut. Overall, I think that the Alpha Moon cut level was actually really cool. I would have loved to explore the ruins of Alpha Halo and also explore a new moon in the Halo universe. It is a shame that we never got this level, but at least the mission that we got in the final game is also still pretty good. The second cut campaign level I want to discuss was under the working title of Covenant Ship. This level is one of the ones that we actually saw the introduction of at the XO2 event with that Halo 2 trailer. It showcased the early introduction of Chief jumping out the Cairo station onto a Covenant C-8S class assault carrier the day of Jubilation. This level was intended to have Chief, instead of blowing up the ship with a bomb in that kick-ass cutscene we got in the final game, but instead being an entire level inside the ship. It would have involved Chief crash landing onto the ship, getting inside, and taking out a lot of Covenant forces. I'm assuming showing more introductions to the gameplay of Halo 2. At some point in the level, Chief would have linked up with some ODSTs and Miranda Keys, who basically you were actually supposed to play alongside in this level at some point. The level would have acted as sort of an introduction to a character. We would see in this original narrative, we would see that she would actually have a grudge towards Chief for her father's death, basically blaming him for the whole event. Continuing onto the level, we were supposed to use alternating trains to pass through the carrier with a view of the ongoing space battle happening on Earth on real time. And according to some of the whiteboards discussing this level, it was also meant to have a skybox dialogue option, which I'm assuming would have been more story about the ongoing battle and maybe about Miranda and her whole thing. The level would have then concluded with Chief using a Wraith, or some variations include a Scarab or a Banshee. Honestly, it's been kind of left open of what other vehicle he would use, and probably was open to the player, and basically destroy the core of the ship. Then like the game, Chief would then have landed in Johnson's Pelican and then head back down to Earth, with Miranda and her crew, I'm assuming apparently at some point during the mission, leaving as well. Now, as we all know, this level never made it to the final game, apparently despite the fact that Bungie already making a sort of portion of it for the XO2 trailer, but it was decided early on that this level would soon be scrapped for the final game. Some at Bungie described it as, quote, too much work, and in a discussion between Marty O'Donnell and Joe Staten on the Halo 2 commentary, they mentioned the level, Instead, it was basically cut to save development time by replacing it with that kick-ass cutscene that basically does the same work as this level would have done so. I overall think that this level would have been pretty awesome and I would have loved to seen it. I think more development with Miranda Keyes would have been nice, and I think tearing the Covenant ship from the inside out would have been sick through gameplay. But this level, I can definitely see why it was cut, as it does seem a bit unnecessary to the overall narrative of Halo 2, and I can totally see why it was cut to save time. And hey, I'm not really complaining. That final cutscene that we got in the game was pretty badass. I love that bomb scene. The third cut campaign level was a level called Infinite Succor. Concept artists Eddie Smith and Robert McLeese explored the idea of a flood-infested Covenant ship, and basically all the horror and elements that came with that. It would have involved a scenario where the flood would have taken over the ship, and the Gravemind have been formed basically from the livestock of flesh on board the ship itself. And, well, essentially the name of the ship would also have been the level name as well, which was called the Infinite Succor. The level was briefly planned out in concept art with various drawings and was discussed at some point early on in development, but it seemed like it was cut from the final game and narrative. Luckily though, the idea for this level was later reused in the 2006 Halo the graphic novel, where in the ship, the Infinite Succor as well, it focuses on a special operations commander, aka Rita, you know, that dude in Elite from Halo 2, and basically his attempts to save his comrades and survive the overall horror of the situation, in a story called The Last Voyage of the Infinite Succor. Overall, my quick thoughts on this level: I would have loved to see this concept explored more in the Halo game. I'm not really sure how it would have fit in the already packed narrative of Halo 2, but I think that the concept still is super cool and has massive potential, maybe for like a game or even a DLC in the Halo universe. The fourth cut campaign level was a level called Forerunner Tank. I did briefly mention this in my Lost Story video, but I want to explore it more in depth here. This was basically going to be two massive levels that took place after Quarantine Zone. It would have featured a different series of events compared to the final game. Like mentioned before, it would have had Chief, Johnson, and Miranda stranded on the ring on run from the Arbiter while attempting to make contact with UNSC forces via radio. Shortly after, a Flood Hulk would have appeared, which basically was an earlier version of the Flood Juggernauts or an original enemy or the Dreadnought even. And it basically would have fought the group, the Arbiter, and also the arriving brutes and Covenant forces. Then Chief and Arbiter and the Hulk would have then fallen into the depths of Delta Halo, and then we would explore the Chief's journey in the bowels of Delta Halo. This journey would have consisted of a Chief attacking Flood forces, exploring the bowels of Delta Halo, also hints at the Gravemind and also some teases from him, and eventually, after fighting tons of Flood Juggernauts and Flood forces, we would then meet the Gravemind in a cutscene similar to the final game. We have also seen smaller details like the Juggernauts giving corpses to the Gravemind for basically additional flesh material, which is just a creepy thought, to be frankly honest with you. And we also seen through Arbiter's point of view his journey to basically meeting the Gravemind as well, instead of the cutscene where he basically just shows up. Now we have already talked about some of the story of this cuts mission, but what about the gameplay? Well, not much is truly known about it besides a few pieces of information we know and heard about over the years. In the level reportedly, it would have had the Gravemind's tentacles basically throughout the level trying to slam and attack the player. It also would have been moving slimly behind doors and shadows, basically the tentacles described as racing freight trains by some of the developers, basically acting as a long drawn out build up to the eventual appearance of the Gravemind that we eventually did see in the final game. At some point in the level, like the name of the level itself, the player would have had to use a large Forerunner tank, so to speak, as described by Jason Jones. Awesome, that blows things up, glows a lot from little windows, and moves really fast. For more gameplay aspects of this level, at some point you could have possibly had a boss battle with the Gravemind itself, but like I said, it's a bit unclear whether this was actually supposed to be in the original level. Still wanted to mention it though. Sadly though, as we all know, this level got cut, and the impact that this level left behind was actually really felt by the team at Bungie who was making the game. It sadly was just one of those brutal cuts made in the hectic development for Halo 2 in order to get the game out to its release date. Jason Jones and Joe Staten on the commentary for Halo 2 did mention the level and expressed many sorrow and sympathies at the decision to cut it. Even one of the developers for the level put in a poem expressing the pain it was to basically to cut it. Hidden in the cinematic scripts for the Gravemind and found on the Halo 2 editing kit, the poem was this: "Oh tank, ill-defined, silent monkey on our backs, no whiteboard will ever display your design. Were you raft, or Forerunner submarine, or monument to our sins?" Just a truly sad situation overall. Now, some remnants of this level, like a lot of the Halo 2 cut content, still made it to the game in some form. Geometry from the Forerunner tank level was actually later used in the gondola we see in the level Quarantine Zone in the final game. Also, some of the tech that was used for the Gravemind's tentacles in this Lost level were later used and repurposed into the mission High Charity, where we would have seen some of the Flood tentacles smash through windows and appear in various places, so that's a kind of cool remnant of this level. Overall, I would have absolutely loved to see this level. I would have loved exploring more of Delta Halo, having a more elaborate build-up and introduction to the Gravemind. I think it would have overall made his appearance a bit better than in the final game. And obviously that Forerunner tank we never got to see would have been awesome to play. It is a true shame that we never got to see this level, but it is still once again a really cool thing to know about in Halo 2's history. The 5th cut campaign level was actually a planned Warthog run leading up to the moment that Chief gets on the Forerunner Dreadnought in the ending of Halo 2. The level was called Forerunner's Ship, and I always found it was interesting because in most of the Halo games there's always usually a Warthog run at the end of the game, but Halo 2 always stood out because, well, there was never actually a Warthog run. But turns out to my surprise, Halo 2 originally was supposed to have one, but sadly got cut, mainly probably due to the hectic development the game endured. Luckily though, we actually get to see this level in real life in a restored mod thanks to the YouTuber Vengeful Vadam. The basic gist of this level would have been you would have basically traveled in a Warthog alongside the tracing beam to the Forerunner Dreadnought that we saw in the final game. In the meantime, you would have avoided obstacles and eventually also avoided enemies as well. This included Flood Juggernauts as well, which were also cut from Halo 2. Eventually at the end of this section, Chief would have jumped out and like the final game would have entered the Dreadnought and said those iconic lines that we know at the end of Halo 2. There were also some storyboards showcasing this ending and parts of this level as well, shown in the early development of Halo 2. Now, why did this level ultimately never made it to the final game? Especially since most of the work on this level have already been done already. The main culprit and reason behind this was probably once again they just did not have a time to fully polish and finish it in the final game. This is especially more of the case as modders would eventually find this section in a level in the files of Halo 2, but it would see it pretty bare bones and incomplete. They would basically have to add enemies themselves, and none of the obstacles in the game are actually solid and you can drive through them themselves. So work on this level obviously wasn't complete, mainly due to the fact that the developers didn't have enough time to finish it in the hectic development of Halo 2. And honestly, it was a true shame that we never got this, as once again the Warthog run has been a staple of many Halo games before and after the fact, and I think Halo 2 needed one as well. I also wanted to briefly mention as well in this Lost level is that there was also a section of the original ending of Halo 2. Well, basically in the Banshee run with the Arbiter to Delta Halo's control room, there was actually supposed to be 2 Scarabs that you would have fought, but this was cut in development, mainly because they didn't have enough time to make it fully fleshed out in the game. Luckily though, modders like Vengeful Vadam were able to add it back into the final game in the Halo 2 Uncut mod, which I highly recommend. And overall, I think that the level Forerunner Ship would have been awesome and an essential add for Halo 2. I think it was always odd that Halo 2 never had a Warthog run, and to my surprise, it was cut from the final game. So it was a true shame we never got this, but hey, at least it was somewhat restored thanks to modders. Now for the final level that we know about that was cut from the original game of Halo 2. And that was essentially the entire third act of the original Halo 2 story, the Earth Arc levels. It was basically a series of 3 campaign levels that was basically supposed to be the ending and the finale to the Halo franchise. The story for this proposed finale starts out with Chief on the Forerunner Dreadnought, eventually jumping out and landing near the Ark, which is actually on Earth this time around. The Ark would have essentially had a design that would be later reused in the portal at Void in Halo 3, but basically it just would have been the Ark in Halo 2. Chief would have encountered some Marines, basically giving them some much needed morale as they're trying to fight Covenant forces near the Ark. Soon they would charge the forces, and then gameplay would have then start. It's kind of unclear how this was supposed to act in the final game, but according to Joe Staten, apparently it would have been very similar to the finale of Halo 3 in spirit. It would have involved 2 Scarabs, and we would have to fight them at some point. Next in the story, Chief and the Marines would then have to face an army of brutes, basically blocking the entrance to the Ark. And when hope seemed lost, out of nowhere, Covenant ships would then glass the army as the Great Schism would have already taken place at this point, with the elites glassing the brutes, in a truly epic and amazing scene that we could have had. After this, in response, 7 pillars then would have came out and formed a protective shield to protect the Ark from all the glassing and fighting going around it. After this then, Chief, Miranda, and Johnson then would have headed down to a section with the Phantom, and Arbiter and 343 then would have made their way into the Ark as well. The next part of the level, according to Joe Staten, would have involved a trench run, with the Phantom and the Arbiter and 343 inside, basically descending into the Ark in gameplay, dodging obstacles, and eventually landing and fighting Covenant forces inside the Ark, and eventually reaching the Prophet Truth basically to stop the firing of the Halo rings. This section kind of reminds me of Halo 4's run into the Composer, and I would have honestly loved to see this aerial gameplay in Halo 2. The gameplay for this Lost level would have involved switching between the Arbiter, or I guess the Dervish in the storyboards, and Chief, as basically they would fight with forces basically to reach truth inside the Ark, and separate little mini campaigns in the gameplay. Arbiter then would finally reach Prophet of Truth, and eventually after a brief dialogue, the gameplay would begin and a final fight with the Prophet would soon start. After this, more brief dialogue continues between Arbiter and Truth, and Chief then eventually would meet up with 343 Guilty Spark and arrive in the control room, eventually maybe indicating the fact that 343 would have been some kind of NPC ally along the way. The Arbiter then would snap Truth's neck as Chief walks up to the console. Chief then would press some buttons and eventually deactivate the Ark. The Ark then sends out blasts to deactivate the rings in the universe. Really just a cool display of the artwork here. The sudden cancellation of this would eventually cause the Ark to collapse. The Chief and the Arbiter would attempt to escape with some gameplay, I'm sure, showing the collapse of the Ark happening in real time, similar to the finale of Halo 3. Chief then would hold up some brute honor guards to allow Arbiter and 343 to escape before him. After this, in a separate journey, we would follow Chief as he runs and escapes and basically cuts to basically almost getting crushed, but eventually escaping the Ark. And then in a flash transition, we will eventually see Chief without his armor, yes, without his armor, getting awarded by Admiral Hood. We will then see Zero-G fireworks involved and basically wrapping up the human side of Halo 2's story. Moving to the Covenant side of things, Arbiter and 343 would eventually head to the Data Vault and the Ark, ultimately revealing the big twist of the game that was originally planned. Humans are Forerunner. And then after this, the finale basically ends pretty similarly to the Covenant part in Halo 3, with the elites basically going back to their homeworld and rebuilding. And funny enough, actually the original post-credits scene for this section of the game would also still have Cortana being trapped in High Charity, which is always a pretty interesting variation and hints that they were still maybe interested in making a Halo 3 in this original version of Halo 2. The legacy of this finale is still being felt in Halo and today. The early development and gameplay for this mission did actually have some decent progress, with the whole map and the Ark itself being prototyped, with even a test map recently being released by the Dig Site crew basically showcasing the test map that they were going to use for the Earth Ark level. And even with this test map, the sheer scale and massive size of this thing just really shows how big they wanted to make this finale to Halo 2. But sadly, the decision was made to basically cut the whole ending of Halo 2, simply because the development was so rushed and there was just never enough time to fully develop it for the late 2004 release date of the game. So Bungie basically had to make the painful decision that they felt ashamed of to basically cut it, and basically save it for a future Halo game, which they obviously would do so in the future. Now for all the progress that we know about in this mission, and like I said before, there were some progress made into this lost ending of Halo 2. Like I said before, the Ark was fully prototyped in the game already, and there was a test map developed and now released by the Dig Site crew. There was also early builds of the level as well coming together, as some pieces of it were shown, like in this screenshot of this jackal on Earth in the Art of Halo book. Also, tons of concept art and designs were also done for this finale. We can see that artwork of the Ark here with the pillars up, which is also pretty interesting. Also in this art, and even on the whiteboard here, Bungie was also used when developing the game and making the deadlines. The Ark was shown here, showcasing that they were at some point initially trying to get this thing into the final game. And another cut and lost element to this level was actually that music for this level was already scored, and dialogue from voice actors was already done for this level, just showcasing how much progress and development was already done for this level. It is super cool to hear this lost dialogue to this lost ending, like here.
This is a Forerunner? No. That is impossible. It cannot be.
And overall, I think it's just interesting and really cool stuff. We also have some more artwork of the Scarab part of this level, which looks amazing. We also have some of Arbiter and Chief basically making their way inside the Ark, showcasing some of the designs for it, which honestly looks amazing as well. To be frankly honest, I think that this level and this original ending of Halo 2 would have been truly amazing, and it is a shame that it did cut mainly due to pure time constraints of development. But overall, I think that it would have been a great ending and a great what if for the Halo franchise. So that was the cut Earth Ark levels in the original ending of Halo 2. Now we're on to the more interesting part of cut content from Halo 2, and that is the early builds of certain levels from the final game. Halo 2's development was always in a flux, with the famous whiteboard we see in the behind the scenes for the game, just to show how fast concepts and ideas were basically cut or exchanged or repurposed. Regardless though, let's get into these lost early builds of levels. The first early build of levels I want to mention is actually the Delta Temple, which was basically an early version of the levels Delta and Regret in the final game. This early level came from the September September 2003 build of the game and actually features some radically different things that we never got to see in the final game. It was actually shown off in a stream by 343, showcasing this lost and early build of the level. One major difference to this level compared to the final game is the fact that the temple is actually set in at night, and basically would have showcased a whole stealth mechanic that was supposed to be in Halo 2, but basically was cut maybe due to resources. We even have cut scripts and recorded dialogue basically showing this early stealth system in action, and overall it's pretty cool. The level would have involved lighting and also dynamic shadows, and basically you would have taken out enemies more quietly and with stealth. Covenant forces would have been on shift patrols, and depending on how the player wanted to interact with the enemies, it also would have depended on how successful he was in the level. Even comm grunts and other enemies would have been alerted if a dead body was found, and basically would sound the alarm and eventually cause all the enemies to attack the player. So it was super crucial that the player would have to use stealth basically to proceed in this section. We even have some scripts and cut dialogue for this mechanic as well in full action, which is also pretty cool. Now, why did this early version of the level never make it to the final release? Well, for starters, the stealth mechanic was hastily cut out of Halo 2 during the rush development, which basically just did not have the time to implement it properly in the final game. Another factor in why this early build of the level was cut from the final game was the fact that the intensive lighting and shadows that were required for a level like this were simply impossible on the hardware for the Xbox at the time, so that was one of the reasons why it was cut as well. And in the result, Bungie most likely reworked the level into the level we got now, which is basically more of a charge through and kill the prophet style of level that we got in the final game. Overall, I would have loved to seen how this level would have came with all the stealth and interesting game mechanics that would have been introduced in this level. I think it would have added a lot of much needed variety to Halo 2 and probably would have been a very memorable part of the campaign. Now, since this was an early level from the Halo 2 dev kit and it was actually showcased on a stream with 343, there is a copy of it somewhere, but most likely we'll never see the light of day, at least at the time of recording, but hopefully one day we'll get our hands on it and see what this early version of Delta Temple was. The second early build of a level that we got in the final game that I wanted to mention is Earth City, which is basically a combination of the level's outskirts and Metropolis from the final game. The early builds of this level that we would eventually get actually strike a huge resemblance to the E3 2003 Halo 2 demo in scope and scale. A large chunk of New Mombasa was sculpted in the map, and even Wraith and Covenant forces would have attacked you as well in a recently released map by the Dig Site crew. It was released as a map called Archaeology, and it has actually been getting fully playable, and you can actually download it on the Steam Workshop. Honestly, my real thoughts on this level is it's overall pretty cool. I kind of like seeing the bigger version of Metropolis and also the scale of New Mombasa as well, making it kind of similar in size to the E3 demo. There's also some cool features on this map like a weird Matrix style signs and also drivable civilian vehicles. I kind of wish these elements were in the final game and they all look pretty cool. And overall, a pretty cool map and honestly a really interesting early build of the level that we could have gotten in the original version of Halo 2. Also, some brief early builds of levels I want to mention but just don't really have a lot of information on include Delta Control Room, which is basically an early version of the Great Journey in the September 2003 build of the game. You would basically spawn on a Scarab docking structure before being attacked by enemies, but other than that, there's not really any other things about this early version of the level. Also, other early builds included a level called Sentinel HQ, which we've actually never seen the build of, but most likely was an early version of the Oracle level. Still though, that was overall some of the early builds of Halo 2 that I wanted to cover. Now for the multiplayer side of things. The multiplayer for Halo 2 in terms of development went along mostly smoothly compared to the campaign's development, but like everything with Halo 2's development, plenty of content was still left out of the final game, and this also goes the same for maps, as there was a lot of maps that were cut from the final game's multiplayer. Luckily though, over the years, the Dig Site team and other modders have been able to restore most of them. So regardless, let's get into these lost maps that never made it to the final game of Halo 2. Anchor Point was a cut multiplayer map for Halo 2 that was actually mostly complete but was cut during the development of Halo 2. The map is actually set on the gas giant of Threshold, the same planet that we actually play as the Arbiter for the first time in the campaign. And overall, I gotta say it's pretty neat in design, and it actually has some cool story lore as well. Essentially, after the mission on Threshold in Halo 2 when the station was collapsing, this map was basically the salvage basically of the heretic soldiers and the survivors were able to build from the scraps that were left behind from that collapsing station. And overall, the design really shows it. I think it's all pretty cool with these bridges connecting separate islands on the map of scraps and also leftover debris, with teleporters throughout the map for easy access all throughout the map. And in terms of size, it's also pretty huge, and it also can support a lot of big game modes. I personally think that Assault or Capture the Flag would actually work best for it. In terms of how complete the map was, it was actually mostly complete with graphics and textures and physics, all looking pretty finished. The map was reportedly cobbled together in like a week by the developers at Bungie, and basically even though it was unfinished as it did not have all the features implemented, like it had some UV issues and also some temporary texture issues throughout, still though in the final product it shows a mostly completed map. The map's original purpose was actually intended for 2v2 aerial combat with Banshees and also a small amount of players that could support the map. Now this really begs the question though, why was this mostly complete map cut? Well, the developers of Bungie felt that it really just played like crap and it was not really fun enough, so they decided to cut the map from the Halo 2 multiplayer. Now, for my personal opinion on Anchor Point, I think it's overall a pretty good map, but definitely needs some reworks for sure. Like overall maybe a better cover, maybe a toned down size, and maybe better maneuverability in the map, though overall I think it's pretty good. And luckily, thanks to the whole update that the Digsight team released, everyone can actually play it using MCC on Steam and some mods, which is honestly pretty cool, and overall that's one of the lost maps from Halo 2. The next map we have that was cut from the multiplayer was a map called Artery. This was basically a small Forerunner style map with basically it all taking place inside of a giant cave with basically a huge underground Forerunner structure as the general focus of the map. My theory is that even though it's mostly complete and with a lot of solid textures and it's not as horribly incomplete as some other maps that we'll cover, it's still a pretty huge prototype with tons of surfaces not finished. Overall though, I think that the concept is pretty cool and I think there's a lot of huge potential, but it seems like this was cut early on in development. And in my personal opinion of the map, I think that there's a lot of really good ideas and elements here, but overall there's not really a huge selling point as it just feels kind of like a generic map. Still though, it's an interesting case of a map that was cut from Halo 2. The next map we have is Backwoods.
I really love the library.
And unlike the name suggests, yes, this map is not about weed. Overall, it's a pretty interesting map with a lot of really interesting forest vegetation, but it's clearly shown as a very early map, very much in the works here. The map has a lot of very interesting terrain, vegetation like trees and such, and in the center, very much in a progress build, a bridge, which looked like it was the center and the focal point of this map. And also a reused skybox from other maps also attached to this one as well. This map was like the last one, probably really early in development, and it also has a lot of potential and some potentially good ideas, but once again, it just seemed like it was too early on to really tell anything from this lost prototype, and it seemed like it was just cut early on in Halo 2's development. Still though, overall it's a pretty cool map. Now we have Soccer, and this is actually a pretty funny cut map from Halo 2, or actually Halo 2 Vista. Soccer, which is the name of the map, which according to that is in the files, not the more accurate name for the sport, football. Well, this map was actually cut later in the development of Halo 2 Vista, but it was eventually found by modders, and basically used for Griffball mainly. And in general, it's not really much to go right home about. In general, it's just simply a soccer field and a stadium with some interesting Halo textures in there. Even has little goalposts on each side of the soccer field as well, just to add to the effect overall. And I think it's a pretty funny map. I mean, the fact that you're just seeing a giant Spartan just playing soccer normally in a normal soccer field is honestly just the concept alone is hilarious. I would highly recommend checking out this map, and it's luckily been released by the Digsight team as well. Overall, it's a pretty funny and cool map. Now we have the map Blood Gulch _ test, and well, like the name suggests, it was a cut early version of the map Blood Gulch that we all know made it to the final game. It seemed that this test map actually came from that early 2003 period of development for Halo 2 most likely, and is a very much just proof of concept and mostly just a prototype. Still though, overall, it's a pretty interesting early version of a map that we all know and love. I also want to mention as well in that 2003 period of time, maps like Waterworks, Headlong, Ascension, Colossus, Lockout, and Midship, which all eventually made it to the final game, also all had 2003 prototype versions of the map released by the Digsight crew as well. Just kind of want to cover them because, well, these maps weren't actually released in the final game, so there's not really too much point in covering them, but just want to mention that these lost prototype versions were released by the Digsight crew as well, and they're all pretty interesting to check out. Cloud City was a map cut from Halo 2, and it is actually oddly very familiar to the beginning of the mission Sacred Icon in the final game, with it even reusing geometry and many assets from that level for this map. And overall, my quick opinion on it is that overall it's pretty decent. It has a lot of good spaces for fighting, but it obviously feels a pretty bit underdeveloped, obviously. Well, because it never got released. But in general, I think the layout is pretty generic and not much to it. I do like some of the weapon placements, and I do like the fact too you can actually exit the map and have a little space you can see some of the reused skybox, and overall it does feel a bit more finished compared to other maps we'll cover. But honestly though, it feels pretty generic, and I'm kinda glad it got cut, to be honest. Still though, an interesting lost artifact, and it did get released by the Digsite team as well. The next map we have is Cyclone, which was a very early cut multiplayer map from Halo 2 that was only intended to be simply a giant design exercise. Max Hoberman, the multiplayer lead for Halo 2, wanted to create the smallest map possible, and basically created some design docs for the layout of this possible map. And indeed, this map was very small, only intending to actually have 2 to 4 players use it at a time, with the map even apparently having adrenaline power-ups throughout as well before that whole system got cut as well. Eventually though, the map got cut early on in development, and it seemed like it never made it past that initial stage, only appearing in design documents. Overall though, I would assume that this map would have been interesting to at least try out, but obviously it would serve as an inspiration and a basis for the future map in the final game, Midship. Still though, this Lost Cyclone map is pretty interesting to know about. Now we have a map called Evergreen, and this map is pretty interesting. As the name might suggest, you might think this was actually some kind of forest map, full of forest vegetation and trees. Well, sorry to disappoint you, that's just not the case. It actually is just a desolate, rocky old map with Forerunner buildings everywhere and kind of a snowy environment. It seemed to reuse geometry from Forerunner architecture from Halo Combat Evolved, but adding more of rusted textures to it. It is overall a pretty decent sized map, with both areas having spawn points for players, with Forerunner buildings facing each other, and I think overall this would have been a pretty cool map if it ever got finished, and obviously some polish should have been added to it. And overall, it's a pretty cool concept, and kind of a shame we never got to see it. Once again though, like a lot of these other maps, it was released by the Digsite team. The next map we have is 4th Station, which was also a cut map from Halo 2, and this one is pretty interesting and has a lot of very nostalgic vibes, and that's really one of the best ways I could describe it overall. It is an indoor map with a decent amount of players possible in it. The setting of it is some kind of UNSC station with tons of corridors and also a central hub area as well, with some power-ups and also some power weapons being placed throughout. Also some pretty cool physics, like you can actually destroy these lamps as well. And overall, it really feels like a homage to nostalgic classic maps that you would see in games like Doom or even GoldenEye, to be frankly honest with you, especially with those tons of corridors and narrow passageways as well, reminding me of those older games. The map also has the feature of teleporters, making it a bit easier to travel, and overall, I do really like this map. Its old feeling to it and nostalgic homage to games like GoldenEye honestly are really cool. And just with some polish and maybe a little bit more work put into it and maybe a redo of the layout, I think it honestly would be a top 10 Halo 2 map. It is a shame that we never got to see this, as it seemed like it made it pretty far in development, but for whatever reason Bungie cut it in the race to save Halo 2. Regardless though, at least it was released by the Digsite team, like most of these maps I'm covering in this video. The next map that we got was cut from Halo 2 was actually a map called Gauntlet, and this map is pretty interesting. It's a section out of a canyon cut out with a lot of Forerunner stuff in the middle. It is a pretty decent size overall in terms of map size, and it's also more complete than some of the other maps that got cut from Halo 2. It looks like it can support definitely 4v4s or 5v5s in terms of multiplayer or other game modes as well. There's also some really cool features on the map as well. Like, I do like some of these interesting pillars, and also some of the art design of the map looks pretty cool. But I do think that some of the spawn placements would definitely have to be fixed, because definitely some of these would have been kill zone if these ever made it to the final release. Overall though, I do think that Gauntlet looks pretty cool, and once again, like a lot of these maps, was released by the Digsite team. It looks pretty interesting though, like I said. The next map we got here is actually a really cool map that was cut from Halo 2, and that is Mission Beach. This map is similar in spirit to a map like Valhalla from Halo 3, with it being a giant big Forerunner map. But instead of Forerunner pillars and structures on each side that the player would actually spawn at, this time around the player would spawn on each side of the map in certain areas and rush to a center of an exploded bridge area with some Forerunner rooms and structures surrounding it in the canyon itself. The map was also surrounded by tons of cliffs and mountainsides, and also tons of other vehicle placements and also interesting weapon placements throughout, with also other passageways across the giant canyon in the center of the map, that which I'm sure would have been a focal point if the map ever made it to multiplayer. We also have this weird cube near one of the spawn points on the map. It looks like it was intended to be some kind of Easter egg or maybe some kind of secret extension to the map, but once again looks completely unfinished. And overall, I think this map is honestly pretty awesome. It has nice space, cool terrain, and the general design and concept is honestly pretty fantastic. It could have easily supported big game modes like BTB or 4v4, and honestly, I really like the concept of this map, and I wish it was actually finished and developed more and made to the final game. Still though, once again, at least it was released by the Digsite team, and it's once again playable for anyone who wants to take a look at it. This map was conceived by multiplayer lead and Chris Carney, who basically concepted this map, Overboard, and a few early concept and design docs for this map. The general idea for this map is to actually focus on a structure that's sitting above a pool of water, with a skybox actually never created for this map, meaning that it was cut pretty early on in development. It's a mostly vertical map with lots of ladders for the players to use against each other, and also tons of pillars for cover as well. Even some early Halo CE teleporters were also put in as well, hinting at the possible development time frame it was actually made in. And it seems pretty obvious that this was actually an early prototype that didn't really make it that far into development. Now, why was this map actually cut? Well, the reason for its cutting was actually because the multiplayer lead for Halo 2, Max, basically disliked the map. He basically had a general philosophy that he disliked maps with vertical or rotational elements, and basically wanted maps with more horizontal mirror layouts involved, which is maybe one of the reasons why the Overboard was cut. As you can see, it's a pretty vertical map in its design overall. And overall, I think that the map is definitely unique and has a lot of really cool elements, and definitely could have been something interesting, but I do think that the vertical nature of it kind of makes it a bit confusing for players, and I think it would just be kind of a challenge in multiplayer, so it's probably glad that this thing didn't maybe make it that far into Halo 2's development. Now, for access to this map, it's kind of unclear. I believe it's some kind of files by modders that they were able to discover it, but as far as I know, it looks like it's unplayable and it's not been released formally by the DigSite team. Now we have a pretty unique and interesting map that actually made it pretty far in development, and that of course was the map Permafrost, which was cut after Halo 2's release in 2004, believe it or not. Now you may be asking, how can this map even be cut after the release of the initial game? Well, in 2007, near the release of Halo 3, Bungie actually released the Blastacular Pack, which was actually released on Xbox Live for about $4 at the time. It was not really included in the 2005 release of the multiplayer pack or the 2007 Vista port of Halo 2, making it quite a unique release. Bungie actually originally intended for it to have 2 remakes of older maps, and also 1 original map. The 2 remakes were actually Desolation and Tombstone, which actually did get released in the map, but that 1 original map that I mentioned got scrapped and never made it to the cut. Now, what was this map actually about? Well, like the name suggests, it was actually an ice and snowy setting map. It was also a pretty good size, with a lot of players being able to be fit in, like a lot of big game modes like BTB or 4v4 easily, and honestly it was mostly complete in prototyping and in geometry. There's actually a really cool section of the map that actually has a lot of UNSC tents, and it seemed like it was some kind of UNSC research outpost trying to research some kind of Forerunner object. There was also another section of the map that actually had an ice cave, which is honestly pretty cool and also has some pretty interesting power weapons as well, with also these really cool UNSC lights surrounding the map with some really excellent lighting. There are also some nice snowy vegetation, and there's also this big focal point of the map, which was this big Forerunner structure in the center with a light bridge in the center as well. I'm sure being a focal point that the players would have fought over if this map ever made it to release. According to the multiplayer lead of Halo 2, the light bridge could have been turned off and on by players to help swing tides of battle. And overall, I think that this map is honestly really cool with a lot of really interesting ideas. Now, why was it cut? Well, despite the fact that the map actually moved pretty far into development with the event and basically the multiplayer lead Max basically seeing a lot of potential in the idea and the map in general, the map was cut subtly in development as the map pack's original release date collided with the release of the Halo 3 beta in 2007. So essentially Bungie had to divert resources away from this map so basically they can actually focus and finish Halo 3's beta, which is honestly a true shame as I overall think that this map is really cool. Luckily though, it has been released in its incomplete state by the DigSite team. Still though, it was a shame that it never got completed. The next cut map we have was a very early concept map from Halo 2 known as Race Day. Not much is really known about this map as no known docs or images of it have surfaced online. The general idea of this map was essentially it was used for experimenting with a possible Car Wars style of a game mode involving tons of vehicles and players that would have assumed attacked each other in a lot of really cool collisions and attacks, but ultimately was cut. It seemed like alongside this initial game mode and also this initial map, it was really just nothing more than that, and the potential for there is obviously huge, but obviously it never really made it that far into development, so I really can't properly judge it. Still though, it's an interesting idea. Now we have a map called Rodentia. This map was cut from Halo 2 Vista, and it was basically a remake of that classic map from Halo Combat Evolved, Rat Race, which is honestly one of my personal favorites from that game. And as a true fan of that original map, I gotta say that this map is pretty faithful to it, with obviously having the same layout but with a lot of updated and brand new graphics and textures for Halo 2 and its new engine, and even some cool new features as well, like all these sections of underneath glass and also the floor as well, with this weird spinning Forerunner drill-like things on the bottom, which honestly add a lot of character to it as well, even with the glass windows showing more of the outside, making it feel more lively in general and less closed in, which is honestly a great improvement. There's even a section of the map where in the original map you would just go into a cave and get some power weapons, but in this version you can actually go outside and see the skybox, which is honestly a really insane and cool difference. And overall, in its general nature, this map is actually pretty complete. There's not really too much incomplete elements to it, and honestly looks pretty finished. It was honestly a shame it never got made to the original cut of Halo 2 Vista. Hopefully though, one day this map can be added to matchmaking, and like always, it has been released by the Digsite team. Overall though, it's still a really good map. The next cut map from Halo 2 is actually a map called Solitude, and in general and concept and theme, it's pretty similar to the map Ascension from the final game. My theory is that maybe this map was a proof of concept or maybe some kind of alternate version of that map. And I would say maybe halfway it was done in development with some textures, and even some general idea of this map was prototyped and laid out, but it was cut early on in development halfway through its life cycle. It features a lot of very interesting things, like a lot of Forerunner structures with the centerpiece similar to Ascension as well. It also has the skybox with the Halo ring just like Ascension as well, with two similar sides of the map featuring platforms for sniping just like that map. Once again, just features a lot of really odd similarities, and once again, kind of proves my theory that this might have been some kind of proof of concept. And overall, while I think the concept is definitely cool, I definitely prefer the final map Ascension, as it feels more organized and more interesting compared to this map, as it feels like the layout's a bit cluttered, unlike the one that we got in the final game. Maybe with some work this map could have been special, but overall I'm glad that we got the map we got in the final game. Like all these maps though, it was once again released by the Digsite team, so it's playable. It's an interesting little side note overall. Sunken Temple or Sunken Chamber was a very early cut map from Halo 2 that would be very familiar to people who have played Halo 2's campaign, as this map was basically ripped straight out that one section in Mission Delta and Regret in the final game. Basically takes a part of that Forerunner structure that we fought those hunters, closed them off, and also changed a few things as well, and basically just at the last minute decided to turn that section of the campaign into a multiplayer map initially. Now, I honestly have never really hated the idea of turning some campaign maps into multiplayer maps. It's honestly a pretty interesting idea if it's, well, done well. And well, how did this map honestly do with that idea? I can definitely see why it was turned into a location of this map. It's pretty spacious overall, and there's a lot of potential for some interesting game modes like 4v4 or other giant big game modes as well in the multiplayer. And I do like the overall really interesting sort of night vibe to it. But I think overall it needs a lot more work and more retooling to make it potentially unique, and also just make it a good multiplayer map, instead of just basically being lazy and copy pasting it from the campaign, which I'm sure Bungie realized the fault of their error and scrapped it early on in development due to the lack of resources, and in general the idea just being kind of dumb. Still though, it's pretty interesting, and it was released by the Digsite team. The next cut map was a map called Timberwind. This was basically a remake of the map only released on Halo Combat Evolved on the PC in that version. And I'm sure Bungie had initial plans to bring it to a bigger audience on console with Halo 2. And a lot of work was actually done into this map, with a lot of textures being mostly complete, prototype, and lots of textures also being put in on as well. And it also is pretty faithful to the original, and it seemed like it was originally supposed to come out in Halo 2 or most likely Halo 2 Vista, but sadly it got cut early on in development. Most likely the developers just didn't have enough time to finish all the kinks in the midst of the crazy development for those games. Overall though, I think this map is pretty cool, and I kinda wish even with some polish it was put in the matchmaking. Luckily though, it has been recovered and released by the Digsite team. Now we have a cut multiplayer map called Shaft, which was originally cut from Halo 2. It's kind of similar to a lot of other maps with Forerunner architecture in it in general. It was basically carved into a canyon of some sorts with a lot of geometrical, interesting layout for all the Forerunner stuff. It's more complete than the other maps with a lot of movable objects and also tons of areas to explore without it really being buggy and glitchy. And even though it's a pretty interesting map, I'm assuming it got cut mainly just due to the issues of the layout, and the overall, there's just not really much of a selling point to this map to really make it stand out compared to other maps. I think in my personal opinion, it just need to be a bit more redesigned, and just more interesting elements need to be put into it. Also maybe just less kill zones for some of the spawn points as well. And overall, I do think this map is pretty interesting, just needs some more work put into it. Regardless though, it was cut early on, and well, let's just say it got shafted. Sorry for the bad pun, but that was overall the map Shaft. The next cut map that we have here is Convergence, and this was actually a cut map from Halo 2 Vista, with even an earlier screenshot version of this map shown off by the Digsite team as well, showing a completely different layout. Just kind of some interesting food for thought there. Now we won't be able to cover that early version of Convergence, we'll just be covering the one that was released by the Digsite team, and in general, this map's general idea is kind of similar to Ascension from the final game, but overall has a lot more unique elements and definitely being better to other maps that try to copy that map in general. It has two bases on each side of the map with teleporters, and also just a lot of really cool designs and interesting symmetrical design of the Forerunner architecture. It also has a pretty interesting center of the map with teleporters and also 3 floors that the players could interact with, even one that having a rocket launcher and also other power weapons as well on the map. And also other side of the maps with the base and stuff have also SMGs included, and even at one point in the map even an energy sword power weapon placement was also put in. I also think that it's really cool with a lot of really cool spaces for vehicles, and in general the skybox also has a really lot of cool interesting elements happening in the background as well, which really adds character to the map. And overall, I think that Convergence is honestly one of my favorite cut maps from Halo 2. I think it has a lot of really cool and interesting ideas, and honestly it feels like a little bit of a cousin to Ascension. It is a shame that we never got to see it, and honestly once again could easily go into matchmaking, but once again we'll just never get to see it. Still though, like mentioned, it was released by the Digsite team, so it's feel free to explore it yourself. Now we have another map that was basically a copy and paste map from the campaign, and that is the map Grotto, which is basically a ripped up pasted map from the Halo 2 campaign, specifically the level Delta Halo from Halo 2's story. And honestly, in terms of differences from that map to the campaign level, it honestly doesn't really have any differences, except for some flag posts, which I'm assuming it was designed to have some kind of capture the flag mode put into this map, and obviously in this map being closed off compared to the version in the campaign. In terms of game modes, it could have easily supported modes like 1v1 or 2v2 style, as basically this is a pretty small map. But honestly though, it's pretty basic and there's really nothing special to it. And overall, I'm kinda glad that Bungie really cut this map, as even though I like that section of the campaign, it just really doesn't work as a multiplayer map. Still though, like always, it was released by the Digsite team if you want to explore it for yourself. The next map we have here was actually a remake of the map Prisoner from Halo Combat Evolved, but just basically renamed to Convict for Halo 2. I'm assuming that it was a cut map for Halo 2 Vista, as it seemed like a lot of Halo remake maps were intended for that game. It would have been obviously in Halo 2's multiplayer and would have given bigger exposure to the original map from that game. Now, I always liked the original map Prisoner, and honestly, it's pretty much the same map here as Convict in Halo 2, but just with a lot of updated textures and also just kind of incomplete in general. I do like some of the slightly different lighting, and also in general some of the different color placements honestly make it more stand out compared to the original version. And also there's some different weapon placements throughout the map, like for example where the human sniper was in the original map now has a beam rifle in it. Now this map obviously, as you can see in the footage, shows like it was pretty completed. It made it pretty far in development despite some points like maybe the placeholder elevators throughout the map, but it looks like it was mostly complete. But at some point during the end of its development it got cut from Halo 2 Vista. And honestly though, I think it's a pretty decent map and a pretty faithful representation of Prisoner from Halo CE, and kind of a shame that we never got to see it. But at least it's been kind of revived by the Digsite team. Now we're going into another section of cut maps from Halo 2, and that is mainly the Halo 2 Vista Map Editor Example map. Basically, the backstory for these maps include the fact that with the release of Halo 2 Vista, it also came with the release of Halo 2 Vista's modding kit, which basically allowed modders to create their own maps for the game. This modding kit for Halo 2 Vista came in with a disc with one map already preloaded, and that was a map called Example. And well, like the name suggests, it was basically just a testing ground for players and modders basically to edit and figure out the tools of the modding kit for the game. But did you know originally there were supposed to be 3 maps also included in the original modding kit to basically help modders figure out the tools of the game, but were ultimately never made it to the actual modding kit itself? Regardless though, let's get into these lost and cut maps from this modding kit and see what they were actually all about. The first map that was cut from the Halo 2 Vista modding kit was actually a map called Earth City Sample, which basically was a giant Earth-based testing map for modders and players. It was set in New Mombasa and overall has a lot of really nice detail and polish put into it. Basically, it's a pretty small map with basically a street filled with cars and other debris as well. It could have been speculated this maybe takes place during the events of Halo 2 for a narrative and lore reason for this map as well. And honestly, it's pretty much complete with a lot of assets being done, sound effects also being put in as well, and overall it's a very small map though, mainly used for 1v1 or 2v type of matches. It seemed like that this Earth style map was mainly just designed for modders basically to get the handle on a lot of Earth objects that the modders could use and design their Earth style maps for Halo 2 Vista. But like a lot of these example maps, it got cut pretty early on in Halo 2 Vista before its release. Eventually though, actually in a weird little story, later on it was actually released by one of the developers of Halo 2 Vista, Hired Gun, who basically helped port the game to Vista and basically uploaded this map to halomaps.org. And even later on it also got released by the Digsite crew as well, basically for more general and easy access to it. Overall, I think this map is honestly really cool and also pretty well complete. I think that even though the small nature of it kind of puts me off, I think that there's a lot of potential and really cool matches that could have been had here if it was released. And also there's a lot of really cool botting possibilities as well. The next map that was cut from the kit was actually a map called Beach Battle, or basically Forerunner Forerunner_sample. The map's general idea is that it's set on a beach with 2 bases on either side of the map, with a central Forerunner structure in the middle, with the skybox set on a Halo ring, maybe possibly Delta Halo, I'm just speculating. You also sit right next to a beach as well, which is one of the major focal elements of this map. You actually go into the water and see all the really nice water effects as well on the edge of the map. There are also some interesting power weapons like a rocket launcher in the center of the map, and also some silent SMGs placed on each side of the map, which were actually cut weapons from Halo 2 that made it to Halo 2 Vista. And overall, my opinion of it is I think it looks fantastic. It looks pretty complete with really nice water animations, skybox, and overall I think that the design of the map looks fantastic. It was a shame that it got cut from the modding kit, but hey, it at least eventually did get released by one of the developers, like I said, Hired Gun, and also the Digside crew as well. And honestly, it's a beautiful map, and I wish it could have made it to matchmaking. Now for the final map that was cut from the kit for Halo 2 Vista. Now, like a lot of these sample maps, this one was actually themed for another side of Halo, mainly for the Covenant, unlike the previous 2 maps. But unlike the 2 maps that actually did get an online release by one of the developers, this map actually never got an actual online release. So for a while, what this map actually was kind of a mystery. We can kind of see from some of the screenshots it looks similar in style to like maps like Midship from Halo 2, and honestly it looked pretty interesting, just kind of a Covenant version of maps we've seen before from the modding kit. And for many years it was kind of deemed as lost content for Halo 2 until years later it was actually released by the Digsite team. From what I can see, it's definitely got a lot of similarity to like the previous mentioned Midship, but also Gemini as well. I think overall it looks pretty interesting, but there's not really much else I can say about this map. And now finally for the development test levels for Halo 2 that never made it to its final release. Obviously these are levels strictly for testing purposes and basically to further development ideas into Halo 2, and were never really meant to be shown to the public as playable levels, just mainly sandbox and testing environments. Regardless though, there's still a pretty interesting cut content for Halo 2, so let's get into these lost and obscure test levels. Now for the first cut level that we have here is actually a level called AI Test, and it actually, well, like the name suggests, it has a very filed type of name. It was mainly just a testing environment from the September 2003 build of Halo 2. It had pretty much a simple corridor Forerunner design to it, with some finished textures here and there, even though in parts it also had those UV textures as well, basically just to show how early and once again how much of a test level this thing was. A build of this level was actually played on stream by Frank O'Connor in 343. The player in this level would have had to fight 2 hunters in this map. There was also supposed to be a Banshee in it, but once again it would have not even been able to fly in it since this was basically a closed indoor map. The player would have spawned into this map and had early versions of the SMG and battle rifle, and like mentioned, it looked like it was just some kind of testing environment by Bungie, maybe to test out the enemies or the weapons or other elements. And overall, it's just a very bare bones map, even more bare bones than other cut maps from Halo 2, and like mentioned, it was just a testing environment, so that kind of makes sense to its bare bones nature. Still though, overall, it's a pretty interesting and lost piece of Halo 2 cut content. Who knows, maybe we'll see it one day. The final test level that was cut from the game was a level called Audio Playground, and like the name suggested, was even more of a test level than the previous one. It was actually shown quite a few times in the behind the scenes doc for the making of Halo 2. It featured a very large terrain where the player would basically test hitting objects or gunfire on a variety of surfaces, which are labeled as dirt, solid steel, ice, water, and every surface in the final game if possible. Its general purpose was basically just to test sound, physics, and basically how everything looks in the engine. And overall, I think it's just a fun little test world. It honestly was something never made for the public and just strictly for the developers at Bungie, but I honestly think one day I wish this thing would actually be made available for everyone to play. It's such something of a little fun test ground just for everyone to try out in Halo 2. The next test level that was cut from Halo 2 is, well, technically a test level. That is actually Halo 2's E3 demo 2003. This demo has basically gone down in history of Halo 2 as being very infamous and also being mostly smoke and mirrors, as essentially it promised a version of Halo 2 that was just impossible to play on the Xbox. And just for your clarification, I do consider it a test level even though it's also a demo, as it once again was just a test environment for what Bungie wanted to do with Halo 2, but ultimately found it impossible with the current hardware at that time. I will go into further detail about this level in a future video to basically it really just deserves its own video as the topic itself is so large and intricate, but I'll give a brief overview of what this demo was. It was a demo being developed by Bungie shown off at the E3 of 2003 with a giant theater display and also a really cool interactive display at the beginning of it with Sergeant Johnson and also some Bungie employees. And then it basically would have showcased a very early version of the Earth City level that was being developed for Halo 2's original story. The reason why it's gone down so infamous in the community is the fact that it features so many elements that just did not appear in the final game, like the crazy stencil shadows, the really dynamic lighting, and also some of the gunplay as well, and well, vehicle hijacking striking animations as well, just never featured in the final game. It also featured a version of New Mombasa that seemed more grand and open, and also just more dynamic sequences in the game overall. And it is really just a huge shame that we never got to see this version of Halo 2 realized. Now, you may be asking, why was this version so infamous, and why is it technically a test level and, well, never made it to the final game? Basically, after the development of this demo, which was already a struggle in itself, they realized after E3 that basically that this demo and all of its hardware was impossible for Halo 2 on the Xbox. The hardware that was used to run this demo was already struggling on Bungie's hardware alone, and it was impossible on the Xbox. So Bungie essentially had to scrap all their work and ideas that they had for the E3 demo. And, well, that's mainly the reason why it's so infamous in the Halo community. Overall, I love this demo. I love the little interactive display at the beginning, and overall, even though it's fully uploaded online, I think it's honestly pretty fantastic, and I wish we got this version of Halo 2. And eventually the DigSci team eventually released the E3 demo, and honestly, like the legendary status it prevails, it honestly is fantastic. I highly recommend y'all check it out on Halo MCC Steam. Now that we have covered many of the lost levels for Halo 2, now we can finally dive into the huge amount of cut enemies, NPCs, and other characters that were cut from Halo 2. So regardless, let's get into this mess. The first enemy that was cut from Halo 2 was actually most notably the Flood Juggernaut, which was actually a massive tank flood form that was actually supposed to be in the original game. It was basically supposed to act like a mini boss battle for the player to defeat. These Flood Juggernauts would basically act as mini intelligent bosses on the battlefield and basically would help gather the flood and attack the player in routes and also decisive maneuvers. It was kind of similar in design to like the Hiragok, which was also cut from Halo CE. It featured having these massive tentacles, and even on legendary difficulty, it would kill the player in just 2 strikes, and also could knock away any cover as well that the player was hiding behind. It also go into this sort of berserk mode and rage against the player, basically almost killing or most likely killing the player. The Juggernaut would also go into this mode called Berserk, that basically once this thing was actually almost dead, it would basically launch against the player in a full fury of attacks. So to say this thing was actually deadly and also awesome would just be a giant understatement. The design of this enemy was actually pretty much mostly finished in Halo 2, as it actually was found in the files by modders years later and actually brought back to light with full animations and also was able to be killed. The weak point on this creature to kill it would have been its eye, and you can also of course shoot the Flood and melee it as well, but if you do that it would mostly just stun the creature, so you would definitely try to kill it at its eye for the most part. Also kind of a weird strange element to this cut enemy was the fact that it was also found in the files by modders for Halo 2 Anniversary, but this time around without the finished textures like in the original Halo 2 model. Who knows, maybe they were intending to actually include this cut enemy in the Anniversary version of Halo 2. Now, despite the fact that the Flood Juggernaut was actually pretty much finished with full on textures and animations, it wasn't fully finished in design though, as it actually did not have a death animation when you killed in the game. It basically would just freeze in place as Bungie never got the chance to finish this Flood form. I also wanted to mention other appearances and things it could do as well. This Flood Juggernaut also appeared pretty prominently in those original storyboards for Halo 2, indicating its original idea and placement in that original narrative. It'll also do things like slam its tentacles to the ground and also taunt the player as well, which honestly just sound amazing. But sadly though, these mechanics weren't actually put into the place in the model that we have today. Apparently the Flood Juggernaut was just supposed to spawn most likely one time per level for the player. And the files of Halo 2 show that this Flood was actually supposed to be in the levels the Oracle, the Sacred Icon, and Quarantine Zone in the final game before it ultimately got cut. According to Robert McLeese, who helped design the enemy, the Juggernaut was supposed to be this uber-intelligent mini-boss, but the suggested intelligence was way too high for what the design needed to use it for, which was a big tank. And overall, that was the general idea for this lost and cut Flood form, but sadly as we all know, it was cut from Halo 2, most likely because Bungie just did not have enough time to implement it and get it fully finished in the game to the degree that they may have wanted it to. This was most likely just one of those last-minute cuts Bungie had to make in the brutal development of the game. This is even more supported by the fact that there was even audio recorded in relation to the enemy and its interactions.
The Eye Arbiter! Aim for its eye!
And overall, yeah, pretty cool stuff. And as you can see, there was a lot of substantial progress, but sadly it just got cut from the final game. Luckily though, unlike a lot of cut elements from Halo 2, the Flood Juggernaut actually did make its way into Halo War, as was mentioned a few times in the Halo Wars 2 logs, before eventually making its full-on appearance in Halo Fireteam Raven, the arcade game, which is honestly just really cool, and honestly I love the fact that this lost and cut enemy finally made it into the Halo universe. And overall, I think that the Flood Juggernaut from Halo 2 was a fantastic cut enemy, and it was really just a true shame that we never got to see it in the final game, as it was just pretty much mostly complete. I love its general design, I love its really really cool animations, and just some of the ideas that some of the developers were going to put into this thing just really sound amazing. It's a true shame that we never got to see this lost and cut enemy, but at least this thing actually made it to the Halo franchise one way or another. The second character that was cut from Halo 2 was actually this thing called the Space Jellyfish, which I know sounds super silly. This was supposed to be a native life form mainly to the gas giant Threshold that was originally obviously the setting in Halo 2 for the level the Arbiter, or originally Alpha S Gas Giant, which was the original name of that level for Halo 2. This life form basically would just sort of fly around the map as the player would be doing tasks and really just wouldn't interact with the player or even harm to it. It would just basically just give some life to the gas giant and add some additional lore to the planet as well. The concept was created by Dave Dunn at Bungie, and it was based on the real-life theory of hypothetical life forms on the gas giant Jupiter, which was the origin for this idea. The sounds, according to the designers for the creature, he described them as whoop whoop, which honestly just sound hilarious. Now, a lot of substantial work had actually been done on the space jellyfish, but overall it was just not yet finished. It had a lot of textures and even a 3D model created, but it wasn't obviously fully finished, with even just in the game just appearing as sort of a gray, textureless thing flying around. It was discovered by Halo 2 modders in the game files under the name space_blimp. And luckily though, over the years since its discovery, it has made it into mods like Halo 2 Uncut, but like I said before, were mostly unfinished. Overall, I really like the idea of this NPC, and honestly it just would have given more character and lore to the gas giant more so than in the final game, which honestly is pretty cool and just kind of harmless to the overall universe. I think it's a shame that we never got to see it. The third NPCs and enemies that were cut from Halo 2 are actually included in the original version of the Delta Regret levels of Halo 2, known originally as Delta Temple in the original Halo 2 build. Now, these early versions of level were supposed to introduce the original stealth mechanic of Halo 2, complete with patrols, an escalation-like alert system, and even the idea that a dead body could sound the alarm and attack the player. Now, the reason why I mention this is that there are actually cut enemies to this system, and that is actually one of them was the Comm Grunt, which was of course a grunt but mainly with comm gear and would have contributed to the whole basically stealth system of the game. According to cut dialogue from the stealth section of the game from Cortana, basically if the Comm Grunt found anything out of the ordinary, it would have alerted the entire Covenant the Chief's presence, causing all of the enemies to know where you were and attack. Sadly though, this enemy alongside the original version of this level was cut from the final game, as basically Bungie just did not have enough time to implement the stealth mechanics, as they deemed that the engine that they was originally used to implement all this system was too complex for the original game, so ultimately this entire system, including this variation of the Grunt, got cut. Overall, I think that this enemy is super cool, and in general I think this whole system would have added much more development and really just cool elements to Halo games that we've never really seen before. And I kind of wish it just made it to the final game, but once again, it's a shame that we never got to see it. Still cool to know though. The fourth thing cut from Halo 2 was the concept of the alien trooper. This character was intended to be a combination of elites and other life forms from the Covenant. This character and concept was actually shown in the behind the scenes doc for Halo 2 with some concept art made and also just basically being discussed early on by Bungie, but it looks like later on in development it was cut as the team basically did not have enough time to fully implement it into the build of Halo 2. Overall, I think that the idea is a pretty loose concept in general, but I think that the initial idea sounds really good, and I would have loved to see it expand in the final game, as once again more enemies of the Covenant is not always a bad thing. The fifth thing that was cut from Halo 2 is the infamous Sharkoi, which was also the original giant enemy cut from Halo Combat Evolved, also known as the Dreadnought. Once again, like Halo Combat Evolved, this enemy was also considered for Halo 2. It actually appears in some storyboards, appearing as a mural in the Covenant while the Prophets were discussing the history of the Covenant. It also appeared in using the model from Halo CE, but just with updated textures in Halo 2. But it looks like somewhere in the development of Halo 2, it was once again scrapped by Bungie, despite the fact that it had a full-on model and render created. Luckily though, despite the fact that this enemy never made it to Halo 2, later on in the Conversations from the Universe booklet that was actually included in the limited collector's edition of Halo 2, it was actually mentioned in the booklet, officially confirming the existence of the enemy in the Halo universe. Which, I mean, overall it's better than nothing, I guess. And even future books like Halo Envoy also expanding upon this cut enemy later on down the line. And even later on, the DigSite team actually recovered the Dreadnought from Halo 2 and released it in some files in their recent GitHub repository update from the game for the DigSite crew. And honestly, it looks fantastic. I love the animations, how it looks more updated than it did in Halo CE, and honestly, I wish it made it to the final game. It always sucks, and it's honestly a truly tragic tale with the Dreadnought, as it once again, it always seems that at some point in Halo games development, it's always considered, even designed and created, and just randomly just gets cut for whatever reason in development for those games. Honestly, it's a true shame. I love this enemy, and I would love to actually see it finally in a Halo game. The sixth thing that was cut from Halo 2 was the Disintegrator Hunters. These seem to be variants of the Hunter, but this time around attached with a lost and cut weapon called the Disintegrator attached to them. These were basically cut weapons from Halo 2 that acted as a sort of a Covenant flamethrower. Now, obviously, since this weapon got cut, this variant of the Hunter also got cut as well. Now, how do we actually know about this enemy's existence? Well, it was actually discovered in the Halo 2 files for Halo Vista, with some audio recovered for the enemy as well, but once again, all this enemy was cut from the final game, which is honestly a true shame that this cut weapon and this variant of the Hunter never made it to the final game. I think it would have added some much needed variety to some of the enemies. The seventh thing that got cut from Halo 2 was an enemy called the Shield Carrier Flood form. And, well, like the name suggested, it was actually just a Flood carrier form, but this time around with a Jackal energy shield attached to them in the front. And these enemies actually made it pretty far in development and were fully designed. They are basically found in modders in the Halo 2 files and actually can be spawned throughout the game using modding tools. And if you actually kill this Flood, it would actually drop the Jackal shield, which the player then could have used, and well, once again, we'll later elaborate on this cut weapon later on, but it was actually a usable weapon in game. Later on though, as we all know, Bungie seemed to cut these enemies as once again, they just probably didn't have enough time to fully fix the issues with them, but also in my personal opinion, just being a simply horrible idea to give the Flood Jackal energy swords. I mean, the Flood carrier forms and in general the Flood were already a pain in the ass, but just then giving them an energy sword in the front basically just makes them so much more harder. I mean, I can't even imagine how difficult this enemy would have been on the Halo 2 Legendary, which is already difficult enough. Overall, I'm just kind of glad that this enemy never made it to its final release. It's honestly a pretty absurd idea, and I'm glad it got cut. The eighth thing that was cut from Halo 2 was actually this thing called a special purpose sniper that we actually can see in the behind the scenes docs for Halo 2 with some various concept art done for it. A variety of designs were considered for this enemy, some having one leg, some having two. It also seemed that this enemy would have been more of an advanced class above those dreaded damn Jackal snipers from Halo 2. God, I hate those things. Now, a lot of work was actually done on this enemy, as seen in this behind the scenes doc. Tons of concept art was done for it, and a possible even build of this enemy was put into the game, but it seemed like it was cut early on by Bungie, probably for a better idea to work on for another enemy. Overall, I think that this idea of a new sniper for Halo 2 is honestly pretty interesting. I think that some of the designs look like really cool, interesting cut snipers from Halo CE and also just more other sci-fi franchises. I think it would have been an interesting enemy, but just needed more further development. The ninth thing that was cut from Halo 2 was actually the Sentinel variants, which are actually planned for the game. This included one that would have basically shot out pulse beams, the same type that the bigger shield Sentinels would have shot out as well. Other Sentinel variants that were considered included ones that would have shot out charge bolts and also used a grenade launcher and also used Needlers as well, which basically hinted at even possibly more variants that were also cut for the game as well that we just haven't discovered. Now, just for a disclaimer, this is not to be confused with the Needler Sentinels that actually did make it to the final game of Halo 2, but were just a glitch, when basically a designer made a mistake of switching the weapons on one of the Sentinels in the final shipped product. Just a kind of weird side fact. Overall, I think that the concept of Sentinel variants would have been really cool and added some much needed variety to the Sentinel class in Halo 2. Once again, kind of a shame that we never got to see it, but still an interesting concept. So that was most of the notable NPCs and enemies that were cut from Halo 2 I wanted to cover. Some of it was honestly a true shame that was cut, and some of them I'm just glad never made it to the final game. And some are just whatever, to be honest. Still though, it's a fascinating deep dive into a lot of the notable enemies and NPCs that were cut from Halo 2. Now for this section of the video where basically we're going to cover all of the lost Halo 2 power-ups, abilities, and gameplay elements that we never got to see in the final game. Just the true scale and amount of cut content here is truly insane, many of it I didn't even know. Regardless though, let's get into the lost and cut power-up abilities, gameplay elements, and other things that we never got to see in the gameplay of Halo 2. Let's get into it. One of the most famous gameplay mechanics that was cut from Halo 2 was actually Sprint, as this game was originally supposed to have it, believe it or not. It actually had a lot of finished work put into it, with even modders finding it in the Halo 2 files and reviving it, with even many weapons also having sprinting animations as well alongside your Spartan as well. Even with this hilarious animation of the player throwing up middle fingers as a fun part of it. Not quite sure if this would have made it to the final game, but just, oh my god, just hilarious. Sprint in Halo 2 would have acted pretty similar to other games like Halo 4. It would have been an ability that the player would have had and been able to use. Basically, if you used it for too long, the player would have ran out of breath and you would have had to recharge. So ultimately, despite a lot of work being being put into this ability for Halo 2, why was it cut from the final game? Well, for multiple reasons. The art director at Bungie during the game's development said it was cut mainly just due to pacing issues, and also it was basically used in some of the early prototyping stages for Halo 2, but once again was cut. Another reason why it was cut was mainly due to the fact that Bungie just didn't have enough resources and just enough memory and space to basically finish it, as basically it was cut in the frantic rush to complete the game. It was either sprint or dual wielding that could be added to the game, and Bungie decided to choose the latter to add to the final game. Overall, it's just kind of crazy to think that sprint could have been an OG Halo game. It would have been really fascinating to see how that would have all played out, especially if it was introduced earlier in the series. And who knows, maybe it would have been not so controversial later on when 343 decided to bring it into the series in Halo 4. I think that sprint would have been a nice element to the gameplay, but I just in general would have to see more of it in action just to see how it would have mixed with those classic Halo 2 elements. Overall though, I think that sprint is a really cool element of Halo 2 that we never got to see. Another cut system that was once again kind of already previously mentioned was actually the entire cut gameplay mechanic of stealth with Halo 2. It would have showcased in the original level Delta Temple like mentioned before. Eventually though, that level got turned into the missions Delta and Regret in the final game. Tons of features were included in this cut stealth system, including an alert system where you're basically killing enemies would have some consequences if the bodies were actually discovered. Also dynamic lighting, sensible shadows were also meant to enhance the overall system and make it work. Also tons of features and enemies are also meant to be included in this game mechanic as well, like the Comm Grunt or Stealth Elites. Also, other cut abilities like Infravision, which were eventually used in Halo 3 ODST, were also supposed to be implemented in this Lost Stealth system. Now, despite some significant progress being made into the stealth system, Bungie decided to cut this mechanic midway in development, as it was realized the engine that was going to be used with the advanced dynamic lighting and sensible effects could not be put into the final game, as there was no hardware on the Xbox that could properly run it, not alone on Bungie's hardware as well. So that's why the reason that the cut stealth system was ultimately never made it to the final game. Honestly, overall, I would have loved to see the stealth system put into Halo 2. It would have added a lot of variety and a lot of interesting elements to the previous gameplay of Halo 2. Kind of a shame we never got to see this system play out. Another cut system from Halo 2 that just never made it to the final board was actually the whole power-up system. Yet, believe it or not, there was actually supposed to be a power-ups mechanic in Halo 2. It was actually mostly prototyped in the engine as well and made significant progress, even existing in paper design documentation penned by multiplayer lead Max Hoberman. It was a whole planned out power-up system that was going to be used in Halo 2's multiplayer, giving it more depth to the overall gameplay. So what were the actual power-ups that would have been used in this lost mechanic? Well, the first one was actually the cut power-up Adrenaline, already mentioned in the design documents in the cut multiplayer map Cyclone. My assumption would have been that this would have gave the player basically faster speed and abilities, basically including reloading and also getting into vehicles as well, but it looks like early on it was cut. The second power-up in this system that was cut was actually called Haste, which according to multiplayer lead Max Hoberman, he described it as, there will be a new power-up called Haste. This will increase your movement speed by 250%. When you move at full speed, you have motion blur. So it will basically act as a speed boost in the game. This power-up was also later implemented in Halo 4's multiplayer, though eventually in the final game, so luckily we have traces of it in Halo still. The third power-up cut was actually Infravision, which according to the design documents from Halo 2, when you use this power-up, you'll be able to pick out opponents better in dark environments and far away. You will also be able to see invisible players. If an explosion goes off while you're using this power-up, you'll be temporarily blinded. It acted pretty similar to the Viscer mode from Halo 3 ODST, and sadly though this power-up just never made it to the final cut. It was only in paper for the most part. It was cut mainly due to the fact that there was a lack of dynamic lighting in the final game, and also the other stencil effects that were just not making it to the final cut due to the development issues ongoing in Halo 2. The final power-up that at least we know about that was cut from Halo 2 was actually Quad Damage. It was actually mentioned in a 2003 multiplayer document on a cut game mode called the Lightbringer, and basically like the name suggests, it would basically just dealt increased damage to players. And it also would have allowed for faster health regeneration as well when you had this power-up. Sadly though, this thing was also cut from the final game, alongside the game mode and just entire system in general. It was eventually brought back though as damage boost in Halo 4's multiplayer, so at least that's something. And overall, that was the lost power-up system for Halo 2. I honestly would have loved to see this put into the multiplayer, as it would have added a lot more depth and more interesting elements to the overall game, but sadly it just never made it to the cut. Still, it would have been fascinating if Halo had this stuff. Other cut items and gameplay mechanics in the final game that I wanted to mention first include the idea of ammo pickups, which basically was a cut element in the game that would have allowed players to pick up ammo on the battlefield. And not just constantly pick up new weapons in the game as well once you run out of ammo. And now, even though this mechanic never made it to the final game, this idea is sort of in the final game, as in Halo you can basically pick up the same weapon type and basically replenish his ammo that way. Still though, overall the idea of an ammo drop off sort of thing like Call of Duty was pretty interesting. Another item that was cut from Halo 2 was actually the idea of health packs, which were a prominent part of the Halo Combat Evolved multiplayer and campaign. The Halo 2 health pack pretty much would have acted pretty similar to the one in Halo Combat Evolved, but this time around it would have had a slight sort of cosmetic difference to it. It would also appeared in some earlier builds of the Halo 2 multiplayer, like in some early 2003 maps and some Milestone 1 maps as well. How this health pack was actually discovered was pretty interesting, as basically it was discovered in the shared map files for Halo 2, complete with the finished model and textures and code as well. And like mentioned, it acts pretty similar to Halo 1's health pack, but just with some slight differences, like not having the red stripe like the original. It also has this weird animation where it would have flashed a stream and basically gave health to your character. And it would have featured this weird animation where it basically would have flashed the entire screen and gave health to your character. Eventually though, as Halo 2's development progressed, the idea of Bungie for the health pack became less and less popular, as the idea of health just really didn't matter as much in the final game, until finally the health pack was cut out entirely from Halo 2's multiplayer, and eventually replaced the idea that health can regenerate their shields on its own now. I think overall the idea of Halo 2, especially as hard that game can be at times, having a health pack is honestly a really fascinating and could have helped out a lot in those moments of the game. I think the idea of basically collecting your health allows you to basically act more cautiously and also act with more skill as you play through your game, and honestly I think that Halo 2 needed some kind of health pack system. Later on though, as we all know, health packs were eventually brought in with Halo 3 ODST and eventually Halo Reach, which honestly was a good improvement. Overall though, that was all of the major cut power-ups and gameplay mechanics and other elements cut for Halo 2 I wanted to mention. Now with that section of the video finally being done, we got even more cut content to discuss for Halo 2. Yes, there's even more cut content. This time around, let's get into the Halo 2 Lost cut game modes that were essentially supposed to be in the final multiplayer of the game. Most of these modes were in various stages of development, but were cut ultimately. Regardless though, let's get into it. The first game mode that we will discuss is actually a mode called Headhunter, which was actually a game mode cut from the final game. The basic premise of this mode is that players would go around, collect skulls, and drop them in a safe zone. Whoever had the most skulls would essentially win the game mode. Now, for actual progress on this mode, it was actually found to be mostly functional, with it pretty much being complete, besides some issues with bottleneck of users and the UA design. Modders actually found a playable build of this game mode from the Halo 2 Alpha multiplayer build from way back in the day. Sadly though, Bungie cut this game mode. Most likely the reason was the fact that they were not able to fix the issues with the bottleneck and the UA design in time before the game had to be shipped off to production. Overall, I think that the mode has a really cool idea and honestly looks fun to play. We did eventually get it in Halo Reach, which is honestly pretty cool, but still it would have been awesome if Halo 2 had it from the beginning. Juggernaut was actually a game mode that was shipped in the final build of Halo 2. The basic premise is that being that one player has extreme health and strength and basically is just being hunted down by other players, similar to other games like Call of Duty. But did you know that a version of this game mode was actually lost and scrapped that would have actually included the Flood Juggernaut being the strong player that the players have been able to actually try to kill. Players would also have been able to control the Flood form, which was intended to be, quote, sturdier, heavier, and actually do more damage and jump twice as high. Players would have been able to use its tentacles to attack other players with the triggers on the Xbox controllers as the buttons. This version of the mode was sadly scrapped as the enemy in question in general for Halo 2 was also cut, resulting in this game mode also being scrapped as well. And also another reason why the game mode most likely got cut was mainly due to the fact that the development time and the manpower to fully implement this game mode also just wasn't there, so they had to cut corners and basically ship out the tamed down version in the final build. Overall, it's a true shame that we never got to see the original Flood Juggernaut form in all its original glory. Still though, it's pretty great that we got the original game mode. Race was a cut game mode from Halo 2 that, like the name suggested, was basically a race to reach all the checkpoints on the map against other players also in the race. Whoever does this first basically wins the game mode. This mode was actually in the original Halo CE, and for a long time it was considered for Halo 2. Even in the mode selection screen in the Halo 2 Alpha with the description of complete the required number of laps before your opponents, blowing away the competition. So it seemed that a lot of work was actually put into developing this game mode, with even an early concept of burial mounds including the race mode as well. But sadly though, this whole mode got cut and scrapped. I'm sure it was one of the many things that the team just simply did not have enough time in the rush to complete the game to fully develop. It's a shame as that this mode would have been sick to have in Halo 2. Warfare is kind of a whole nother topic entirely, but this was basically a massive massive cut game mode from Halo 2 with a lot of great ambition behind it. The mode consisted of a massive scale Spartan versus Elite asymmetric battle with up to 32 players involved in this game mode at some point. And even back in the day, this was a huge feat and ambitious for the time for Bungie to even attempt. And honestly, the story behind this game mode and legacy behind it is really fascinating, so let's get into it. Back in Halo Combat Evolved's development, plans for a large-scale multiplayer game mode featuring Marines versus Elites in a round-based setting were basically being developed. Players would have to attack, defend, and attack and control certain points in the map basically to win, with players having the ability to choose different locations to spawn and attack enemies, similar to modes like Battlefield. This mode was worked on a bit with some light prototyping done with Bungie while they were working on the game while in Chicago for Halo Combat Evolved. But after Bungie was bought by Microsoft in 2000, in the scramble to finish the game, the mode was abandoned as simply just not enough resources were put in place for it to be fully developed. But larger scale maps like Blood Gulch did have hints of a larger scale multiplayer that those maps were originally intended for, and hinted at that Lost Warfare mode that we've been discussing. Now, when it came time for the development of Halo 2, the multiplayer team wanted to bring this idea back for the multiplayer. A design doc was created by designer Janie Greener with top-down designs for the mode for what it was intended for. The version in Halo 2 that they were working on was similar to Big Team Battle but larger in scale, with a max of 32 players proposed, whether or not at the time that was possible on a network level. Spartans versus Elites across a big map where players would have to control certain points and also do certain objectives as well. Vehicle combat was also planned for this mode due to the sheer size of the whole thing, even with players having the ability to apparently call in airstrikes on your opponents like Call of Duty being planned as well. Jamie presented this planned warfare mode to Jason Jones at the studio, but other people on the multiplayer team like Max Homerman basically wanted to have the multiplayer go away from this big online warfare style of mode and basically move the multiplayer into more of a LAN style of play essentially, as most of the people at the time did not have a stable broadband internet connection to support the size of such a mode. Eventually though, as the Halo 2's multiplayer development progressed, eventually Hoberman would win out and get his idea ultimately greenlit. Still though, at the time, both ideas were seemingly greenlit, as Jamie and other designers continued to work on the warfare mode on a separate sect of the multiplayer team, while at the same time Hoberman and his team were working on a smaller scale multiplayer focusing on 2v2 or 4v4 style of play, with large scale arena multiplayer and party style couch system mechanics being implemented later on. Later on in the development of 2003, as the game started to progress in its development, a design document from Jamie showed that there was actually little active development being actually implemented for warfare. Despite this though, some documents still showed that there was some hope for the game mode to make it to retail, and it was still being considered for Bungie at the time to make it to the game. Eventually though, Jason Jones had Hoberman lead Halo 2's multiplayer team entirely, and incorporated the Warfare and Arena teams together to basically get the multiplayer out before the deadline to ship the game. And seemingly in the scramble to develop the game in 2003 to 2004, it seemingly this was the official death nail for the game mode, officially canceling the mode at the studio officially. Eventually though, the idea of Warfare in Halo 2 didn't eventually all die out, as life signs for the mode still continued and trugged along in Halo 2's development, as later on in Halo 2's alpha, Warfare is actually listed in the multiplayer selection screen, which I'm assuming Bungie was still holding out hope that they could actually get the mode finished in time for the game's release. But as we all know, it never made it to the final game. It was mainly cancelled mainly due to the fact that they just simply did not have enough time in Halo 2's brutal development to basically finish it. And also all of the networking and supporting issues that would have been done to make it work, it just was impossible to get it out in time. And sadly though, that was the end of Warfare. But the legacy of this game mode, even though it never made it to Halo 2, did live on in the Halo universe. In Halo 3, Warfare was once again considered, but it was scrapped early on. Later on, this mode really just couldn't catch a break. In Halo Reach, a mode called Invasion, which was basically a big 6v6 mode, which was similar to Warzone, did ship, but once again, it wasn't on scale like the original Warfare mode that was considered back in the day for Halo 2. And finally, in some good news, in 2015, in the game Halo 5 Guardians, yes, that game, a mode called Warzone was shipped. That was essentially the same thing with vehicles and also a huge amount of players, and essentially was the same thing as the original concept of Warfare from back in the day with Halo 2. So at least it lived on in that way. Overall, I think that the mode Warzone was super ambitious for Halo 2, and honestly if it was fully realized and Bungie had the time to develop it, it honestly would have been amazing. But at the same time, back in 2004, I'm not really quite sure if such an ambitious mode with a 32 player max would have been even possible possible. I mean, it might have been possible, but just would have been extremely difficult. Still though, this mode was super cool, and I'm glad that this concept lived on later on in other games and eventually making it to Halo 5. Now that we actually have covered the mostly finished game modes, or at least the modes that have a lot of information about them, now we get to talk about the prototype modes. Modes that are essentially started on but were never actually finished. The reason why we actually know about these is actually in the code for Halo 2, there was a fork in the code called MP_partygame_prototype. That was basically split off by modders that showed off the mini game modes that Bungie was working on, but never got to the actual completion stage. Regardless though, let's get into these lost game modes. The first of these prototype game modes was actually Infection, which was originally supposed to be in Halo 2, believe it or not. The mode, as we all know, the premise is essentially an infected player basically infects other players till basically one side consumes all the other. The actual development on this mode actually was mostly far along, with the team changing aspect of the mode still being there, and the mode also did make it to a prototyping stage, but ultimately at the end of the day never made it to the final cut and got scrapped. Most likely due the resources and the time constraints thanks to Halo 2's brutal development. Now luckily though, as we all know, Infection will eventually show up in Halo 3 and become a huge staple of the games ever since, and honestly it's one of my favorite modes in general. The mode was also eventually recovered and at least discovered after 343 recovered the fork in 2018 containing the lost prototype game modes, and the modes were eventually added to the Halo 2 editing kit and eventually were released in 2014 by the Digsight team. Overall, Infection is one of the best game modes in the Halo series, and the fact that we almost got it in Halo 2 is truly insane, and it's honestly a shame we never got to see it, but still overall I'm glad it appeared in the series. The second cut prototype mode that made it to Halo 2 but was cut was the mode called Medic, a mysterious Halo 2 game mode recovered by the Digsight team. The basic premise of the mode would be a player would spawn in a bounding zone surrounding them, and basically hinting the name most likely would involve healing other players in order to win the game mode. Sadly though, that looks like that's all the information we've been able to gather about this game mode, and as we all know, it got cut. I'm assuming just because Bungie didn't have enough time to properly make it work in the game. Overall though, it does sound like a pretty interesting game mode. The third cut mode that never made it to Halo 2 was actually the mode called VIP, which was later implemented in one of the released incomplete modes for Halo 3 by the Digsight team. So it's overall pretty interesting that this little incomplete mode still in a way was originally supposed to be in Halo 2. The next section of the game modes part is I want to actually talk about the modes that never really had any serious development done on them, really just most of them being on paper. The first of these was a mode called Assassin. Its premise was essentially that the game would choose a player as a target, and it was basically the other player's job to basically take him out. The mode was written by Max Homerman and some design documentation, but ultimately it never really got past the planning stage and development. Most likely got cut just due to the fact that Bungie decided to put resources into other game modes that they felt would work better for Halo 2. The next mode that got cut was the already mentioned Lightbringer mode, where basically the player has quad damage and has to survive with it to the end of the mode. Design documents for this mode were created by the multiplayer lead Max Hoberman, but was cut, only making it to the planning stages. Most likely just wasn't the fact that there was a lack of resources, but also just other factors that probably contributed to its cancellation. Overall, that was most of the notable game modes that were cut from Halo 2. A lot of them that were super cool and interesting, like of course Infection, Warzone, and others that sound interesting and could have been amazing, but we just simply never got to see them realized. Overall, a pretty interesting part of Lost Media for Halo 2. Now for the cut vehicles for Halo 2, and my god, there's quite a lot of them. Some of them actually may even shock you, to be frankly honest with you, the fact that they were originally supposed to be in Halo 2. Regardless though, let's get into the human side of things, the UNSC cut vehicles. Let's get into it. The first vehicle cut that we have on this list is actually the Falcon, which surprisingly enough was originally supposed to be in Halo 2, a fact that even surprised me, to be frankly honest with you. The origin of the Falcon started out as basically the need for a Black Hawk type of vehicle in the Halo universe that would essentially transport troops as needed in combat situations. It kind of would act as a smaller cousin to the Pelican in a way. The design of the Halo 2 Falcon basically bore a resemblance to a strike fighter and was basically piloted by one person instead of two. It would also feature an open space to carry passengers throughout the battlefield and also pick up supplies as needed. Now for the actual development of the Falcon, it actually made it pretty far. The Falcon was actually prototyped in 3D shortly after the release of Halo Combat Evolved, showing Bungie's excitement about the concept and vehicle. And eventually the Falcon was made into a poly blockout model that players could get into and fly using some modding tools in Halo 2. The Falcon even appeared in some early beta builds of Halo 2, and it was eventually recovered fully with the Blackout's rough state, so to speak, in the map files for Halo 2 in the Master Chief Collection. Sadly though, even though this vehicle actually made it to some kind of block-out model, eventually though the early progress on this vehicle was cut from Halo 2 early on. It seemed like the reason behind its cancellation was mainly due to the fact there was just a lot of time constraints and they did not have enough time to finish the vehicle, and also just to get it working properly in the engine, which it was probably most likely one of the reasons why it was cut. Luckily though, the legacy of this vehicle is still being felt, and obviously the fact that we even able to get it restored in game is still a huge feat. Mainly thanks to modders in Halo, it was found in MCC in the files and was actually able to be used by players, like I said before, using modding tools. And even people like Ventral Vadem were able to restore it fully with even its OG design and also physics put in, and honestly, it looks fantastic. Fascinating enough, the development on the Falcon still continued even after Halo 2 wrapped up, surprising though with the idea being worked on in Halo 3, but eventually being transformed into a vehicle called the Hornet that we eventually got in the final game. And despite the fact that the vehicle technically in some way did get made, the designer of the OG Falcon from Halo 2, Marcus Lita, was unhappy with the Hornet in Halo 3 and pushed for its inclusion into Halo still, until finally in Halo Reach it became the UH-144 Falcon that we all know and love. Its role in the game was basically as a Black Hawk sort of role, where basically players would use it to basically fly around the map and transport things. It's basically acting as a basically glorified UNSC smaller version of a Pelican. Its design this time around was more centered around helicopters and overall aesthetic and design, being different from the original Strike Fighter inspired design from Halo 2. Regardless though, it's a classic part of Halo Reach, and honestly I'm glad it made it to the game. And overall, I think it's extremely cool and fascinating that the Falcon was originally in Halo 2. And it's a giant weird journey to basically getting the one that we got in Halo Reach is honestly really crazy to think about. I think that the original design that we see in Halo 2 looks pretty cool, especially with the more resemblance to like a Strike Fighter. Is honestly an interesting deviation, but overall I'm pretty happy with the final version of the Falcon that we got in Halo Reach though. Still though, the weird story of the Falcon from Halo 2 is fascinating and one of those cool little lost tidbits of information. The next vehicle that was cut from Halo 2 that once again took me by surprise was actually the Mongoose. Yep, that famous ATV vehicle that we got from Halo 3. Believe it or not, it was originally supposed to be in Halo 2. But the Mongoose in this version of Halo 2 actually featured a similar but also radically different design than the one we got in Halo 3, and actually had a lot of development work put into it, with it mostly being complete before being cut, with the vehicle being fully built, rendered, and even textures and animations put in as well. Also the vehicle being fully drivable with particle effects in the environments being testing out. Also the driving sounds for it were basically the same as the Warthog and were also implemented into the vehicle as well. Also early ideas for this vehicle included an aiming reticle taken from the Magnum, with the designers testing out the front end weapons for it, basically being able to be used in gameplay. So with a lot of work included, with even screenshots of the Mongoose also appearing in some of the early builds of Halo 2 and also shown in the behind the scenes doc pretty extensively, like here in the audio test environment we see that they're actually using the Mongoose to drive around that map, which is honestly pretty cool. Regardless though, with all this work put into the vehicle, why did it actually get cut? Well, despite the fact that there was already a lot of work put into the Mongoose and making it pretty far along in development, it was ultimately cut from the final game. The reason why was because the designers felt that it interfered too much with the mechanics of the Warthog and the Ghost in the game. Felt like it was mostly going to be unbalanced. And ultimately, that was the version of Halo 2's Mongoose that died. Later on though, as we all know, the Mongoose was eventually brought back in Halo 3 with more of a military and updated design to it, and eventually obviously being a staple of the series soon after. For kind of a fun little bit of lore added on, this version of the Mongoose from Halo 2 was actually canonized as the M270 Mongoose in the Halo universe, basically acting as the pre-Mongoose to the finalized version of Halo 3 that we got, which honestly was a pretty nice reference to this version. Now, did this lost vehicle ever get released by some modders or was discovered in any sort of way? Well, despite the fact that we knew about it for a long time, we weren't actually able to get our hands on it until recently the DigSci team actually released it in one of their cut maps from Halo 2, and honestly, it's pretty fantastic. You know, it has some wonky physics to it. Overall, for my thoughts on Halo 2's version of the Mongoose, I think it's honestly pretty cool. I do like the more sporty ATV design to it, and while it's definitely different to what I'm used to, it's still pretty unique and cool. And from my personal experience trying this thing out in game, it definitely plays as a faster version compared to the one in Halo 3, and honestly I think it's pretty cool that Halo 2 almost had a Mongoose. I think it has a lot of potential, but still I'm ultimately happy that this thing actually made it to the series. The next cut vehicles from Halo 2 were actually the Scorpion variants. This was an early concept from Halo Combat Evolved, but was never fully developed and never made it to the final game. When Halo 2 became active development, the idea was actually reintroduced into Halo 2, with 3D based models being made and some work being done on them, but none of it fully making it into the final game. The first of these cut variants was actually the M808B2 Sun Devil, which was basically an anti-air turret version of the Scorpion tank. It had some early development as the Halo CE Scorpion and was used as a base basically, and he designed the variant in the original engine in that game, which then again they would later convert it with updated textures and put it into the Halo 2 engine. But sadly though, this variant of the tank never made it that far, as it was never incorporated, as far as I know, into that engine. The next variant that was cut was actually the Tarantula. It was basically a Scorpion equipped with a missile launcher, which honestly sounds really badass. Like the previous tank version, the developers used the engine from Halo Combat Evolved as a base, and eventually they would put it into Halo 2 later on. And it seemed later though, Bungie would eventually give up on these variants as they never incorporated it into the Halo 2 engine or anything like that. Maybe just due to the fact that they weren't interested in the concept or just didn't have enough time to fully implement it in the game. Luckily though, later on the dig site team did recover these lost tank variants and put them in the dig site demo level from Halo Combat Evolved, which is honestly really cool, and I think a lot of these variants have a lot of potential, especially that badass Tarantula one. I mean, come on. The next major UNSC vehicle that cut from the final game was actually the SHIELD ship. This was the large ship found in the Milestone 1 defensive mission, which is one of those several test bed levels in early development that test out all of the new features they were planning for the game. In this specific mission, one of the objectives was the fact that the players would have to clear out troops for this ship to land and basically defend it throughout the level. Some progress was actually put into the SHIELD ship as it did make it fully modeled into the game and was actually concepted by Eddie Smith. Tons of concept art was done for the ship, and possibly at one point, maybe Bungie was considering the fact that the players could have even have been able to control the ship. Sadly though, like the unreleased Milestone 1 levels, they actually also got cut from the final game. Luckily though, years later, the dig site team did recover these levels, including the ship as well. Also, a little bit of nice icing on the cake, so to speak, the ship was actually canonized in the Halo universe, first appearing as a non-canon Easter egg in Halo Reach Boot Camp, the graphic novel, then later being canonized as a UNSC Arteris, which was basically a refit heavy-lift drop freighter with 4 salvage Covenant energy shield generators put onto it. It's honestly a really nice thing to see that it was put into the Halo universe. And overall, my thoughts on the SHIELD ship from Halo 2, I think it's a really interesting concept that we could have had. And overall, I think the idea of a SHIELD ship in Halo is honestly really cool, and the fact that we could have maybe even piloted such a craft would have been honestly really amazing. It could have opened the door to more interesting flying sections and games, but it's kind of a shame that we never got to see this idea fully realized. Now we have a vehicle called the Strike Fighter, which is basically a cut vehicle from Halo 2. And overall, this was actually a vehicle that really had nothing to do with actual gameplay, but this was merely a cut pure cinematics vehicle, only supposed to be appearing in cutscenes and maybe sections of scripted gameplay in the campaign. The concept for this fighter was thought up around the same time the Falcon was being developed. Early storyboards for Halo 2 showed the Strike Fighter in the Cairo Station level and also the cut Covenant ship level. It would have basically performed a role similar to the Longsword in the final game, where it would basically perform an attack run on the Covenant carrier, bombing it. Later on though, as we all know, Bungie cut the vehicle and basically swapped it with the Longsword in the final game. I'm assuming the reason behind its cancellation was maybe that Bungie was not happy with the Strike Fighter's development and maybe just felt it was easier to put an already developed asset like the Longsword, which was from Halo Combat Evolved, into the game. Still though, a very interesting concept. Later on down the line, the Strike Fighter would live on with the Saber in Halo Reach, basically acting as a similar sort of vehicle that we have in that game. And kind of a weird coincidence, the design of the Strike Fighter also bears a lot of resemblance to the jump ships in Destiny. Who knows, maybe it would have served a similar purpose to that as well. I think overall the Strike Fighter's design in Halo 2 is honestly a really cool and unique vehicle, and while it was only supposed to be a pure cinematics kind of thing, it honestly wouldn't have hurt if it was put into the game. Honestly, it's kind of a shame we never got to see this Halo vehicle in the universe. The next cut vehicle from Halo 2 was actually the Orca, which was mentioned in design docs for Halo 2. Its purpose was basically going to be a troop carrying watercraft. Even other documents show a variant with mortars attached as well. Sadly though, not much is also known about this vehicle, with really no art or models that have been able to be fully recovered. covered by it. It was shown briefly in that behind the scenes doc for Halo 2, but that is really it. I know that Bungie for a long time has toyed with the idea of watercraft in games, and sadly this was just another cut concept that never made it to the final game. Overall, I think it's a shame that we never got to see this, as I honestly would have loved to see more watercraft in Halo, but it is what it is. The next vehicle that we have here might have been a cut vehicle from Halo 2, or just might have been a joke and never been intended to ship in the final build. Either way, it's a hilarious little cut vehicle from the files in the game, basically called the Piglet. It was basically a very scaled down version of the Warthog that had no animations or collision physics required for it to be usable in the game. It was kind of like the toddler's version of the Warthog, kind of like your bike you usually have training wheels put onto it. And honestly, it's so cute and hilarious. I mean, oh, look at little Master Chief in that little vehicle, just so cute. And luckily we know about this vehicle thanks to the fact in a breakdown by Kenneth Peters in the MCC fighting update on Halo Waypoint forums, he made the vehicle drivable thanks to modding and eventually was released by the Digsite team. Overall, I think this thing is absolutely hilarious, and I honestly think this kind of thing really should just be in more Halo games in the future. The next cut vehicles, believe it or not, were similar to the Scorpion in Halo 2, in the fact that we were actually originally supposed to be getting Warthog variants in Halo 2, but sadly never made it to the final game. The origin of this idea was actually a concept created by artist Marcus Wheat. Images of these cut vehicles were soon shown on the Bungie.net back in the day, really proving the existence of these things during the early development of Halo 2. One of these vehicles was actually the rocket launcher Warthog, but not the one that you're thinking of. This one had a different design than the one we all know, featuring a rocket turret that had vertical barrels instead of horizontal ones that we have in the final games. Players would have been able to use triggers to fire rockets in quick succession with not really too much of a cooldown time. I'm not sure if that's just due to the fact that this was an unreleased vehicle and Bungie was not able to get all the balancing issues right out the way, but still pretty hilarious. This variant actually made it pretty farther compared to some of the other variants. Even some screenshots were posted back in the day from Bungie.net and some of the early versions of the multiplayer, and obviously it did get released by the Digsite team as well later on, but as we all know, it got cut from the final game, which was a true shame. Other variants of the Warthog were also designed, mainly using Halo CE as the base for the designs, similar to the other Scorpion variants like mentioned earlier. These variants included the Tropic Warthog, the sick-ass Arctic Warthog, and of course the Recovery Warthog, with all these variants having design docs made for them in Halo 2 describing their appearance, with also other design docs mentioning the fact there was also supposed to be plans for a desert camo Warthog and a night mission camo Warthog, but these never actually made it to any kind of prototyping and were just mentioned in the design docs. And while all of these variants of the Warthog eventually made to some sort of development, obviously making to some kind of prototyping as we obviously have them in the game, eventually though all these variants never made it to the final game as Bungie basically scrapped the whole idea, most likely due to the amount of development time it would have required for all these vehicles, and also just the levels in general, how they would have basically required the use of these things in gameplay. Regardless, so the idea of Warthog variants eventually didn't die in this game, and the idea would eventually make it into other games, like the already mentioned Rocket Warthog from Halo Reach, and also the Recovery Warthog, which also did somewhat appear in some form in Halo 3, which is honestly pretty cool. Overall, I love a lot of these variants, and I kind of wish that they should be in a Halo game. Overall, I love the idea of Warthog variants. It adds a lot of variety to the classic Warthog in Halo. And honestly, the fact that Halo 2 was originally supposed to have this is pretty crazy. And honestly, I think that the fact that some of these ideas like the Arctic Warthog or the Tropic Warthog honestly sound fantastic, but they need to be given the right context in the game and the proper level designed around them. Still though, it's a cool concept. Other quick human vehicles that got cut from Halo 2 I wanted to mention included the Doozy, a water vehicle that had 2 seats. It had a lot of work put into it with tons of concept art made and even a playable version using Halo CE as a base, and was actually restored thanks to the Digsite team. It was also mentioned in the behind the scenes doc for Halo 2, and like we all know, it got cut from the game. Most likely just due to the sheer amount of work would have to be put in to basically make this thing properly run in the game. Bungie probably just didn't have enough time to get all the water mechanics made, and also the fact that if you're going to include a vehicle like the Doozy, you kind of have to make a level just basically using this thing as a concept, and that would require a lot of development time. Still though, overall a pretty cool vehicle. Another cut vehicle from Halo 2 was apparently the Kestrel, which believe it or not was supposed to appear all the way back in Halo 2. The idea for this vehicle was that Bungie wanted to essentially be the human version of the Banshee. but sadly the vehicle was cancelled and scrapped. It was cut mainly due to the fact that the team did not have enough time to basically make the physics around the vehicle work in the engine for the game, which was honestly a true shame, as it was also cut from Halo Combat Evolved's development as well. Luckily though, this vehicle is still a really cool idea, and I do kind of wish overall it made it to the game. Well, that was most of the notable UNSC cut vehicles from Halo 2. Now for the next section, we're going to be covering the cut Covenant vehicles, which like UNSC were actually quite a few of them never made it to the final game. Regardless though, let's get into the cut Covenant vehicles, at least more of the notable ones from Halo 2. The first cut Covenant vehicle was actually the Anti-Air Raid, which was originally supposed to be appearing in Halo 2. This vehicle did make it to some prototyping, and definitely some work was put into it, as it was developed using Halo CE as a base for it. The idea for this vehicle is it was simply a raid with some plasma AA guns attached to it for anti-air support. And like I said, despite the fact that there was some development put into this vehicle, it looks like the reason why it never made it that far was the fact that number one, it never made it into the Halo 2 engine. And also probably just they didn't have enough resources given the time to make Halo 2 to make the vehicle put into the game in a reasonable way. And number two, just not enough resources or time was given to make this vehicle made possible in the game. Luckily though, the concept for this vehicle would never die out, as it will eventually appear later on in Halo 3 as the Oak Patter Anti-Aircraft Raid. It was pretty much just the same version that we could have got in Halo 2, but just with some minor differences. And later on, like many of the cut Halo 2 vehicles that used Halo CE as a base, it was actually made playable thanks to the Dixite team. Overall, I think it's pretty cool that Bungie was originally wanting this vehicle to appear in Halo 2, but honestly I'm not that disappointed, as it eventually did make its appearance in Halo 3, so obviously problem solved. The next cut Covenant vehicle that was originally supposed to be in Halo 2, believe it or not, was originally the Chopper. This vehicle was intended to be a major showing off point for the Brutes in Halo 2, showcasing their whole society and how their vehicles would work in the universe. And also the idea and the concept behind it was that Bungie wanted it to be basically a motorcycle for quote tough guys. The idea for this vehicle was actually conceived by Eddie Smith, with the version being made for Halo 2 pretty much looking like the one that we got later on in Halo 3, but with basically the canopy and the back section of the chopper being the only major difference to it. Sadly though, it was cut early on in Halo 2's development, as it seemed like it was only conceived and no actual models were actually made and put into the game. Most likely it was cut due to the fact that you just did not have enough resources or time to finish it properly in Halo 2. Luckily though, as we all know, eventually the chopper was resurrected in Halo 3, and soon would become a staple for the Brutes in the franchise. Overall, I'm really happy with the chopper in the final game, and it's really cool that we could have got it in Halo 2. It only would have made this game even better. The next cut Covenant vehicle concept was actually really fascinating, which was the idea of Brute mounts. In early design documents for Halo 2, it mentioned the idea of Brutes mounting animals into battle, an idea that was later conceived for future games unrelated to the Halo franchise, kind of similar to the Locust and Gears of War. Sadly though, beyond some concept art that was made for this idea, it never made it actual any kind of form of mechanics or prototyping in Halo 2, as it looked like it was cut early on, maybe due to the fact that they just didn't have enough resources or time to properly put into the game, or maybe that Bungie just wanted to pursue something else. Overall, I think this idea was honestly a real shame that we never got to see it in the game. I think it's a great idea. I think it suits the Brutes perfectly. While I am happy with the choppers in the game, I think that the fact that the Brutes riding animals honestly fits a bit better with their character. It's a true shame that we never got to see it in Halo 2. The next piece of cut Covenant vehicle or cut content for Halo 2 was actually the idea of the large Covenant artillery cannon from Halo 2, but at least in its original version. The reason why it's known as Lost Media is that in the 2003 demo of Halo 2, it was actually seen in the background firing on the city of New Mombasa. With a huge difference from the Covenant cannon that we got in the final game is the fact that it's enormous, basically shooting at the city before longswords were called in to bomb it. Also, other design documents for other cut levels and maps include lost objectives to destroy this massive cannon at some point in the gameplay as well. But sadly though, this version of the cannon was cut from the final game. Bungie probably just most likely scrapped this, as maybe the engine that was used in the final game could not render such a thing on its scale and also be properly used in the final game. Luckily though, the idea of the Covenant artillery cannon did make it to the final game, but just much more of a smaller scale version of it, which was actually called the Type 48 Weevil cannon in the level Outskirts. It's just kind of there and it doesn't really do anything in the game, but if you have some mods you can actually make it playable. Overall, I think the larger version of this cannon wouldn't have hurt anything. I think it's honestly really cool. It kind of acts like a big siege cannon of some sorts. And honestly, I think the idea is really sick and awesome. And the fact that we could have even had objectives to destroy this thing honestly would have added so much cool gameplay moments to the game. Overall, Overall, a bit of a shame that we never got to see this larger version of the cannon. The next cut Covenant vehicle actually was mentioned in some early design documents for Halo 2. This included the idea of a Covenant field truck. Yes, you heard that right. Truckers and grunts in a Covenant field truck. Jesus Christ. The vehicle was mentioned in some early design documents for the game and was briefly thought up, but it was cut early on as basically not really much of anything was done on the vehicle. No concept art or any kind of prototype or model. It was cut early on probably just because of how absurd the idea sounds. But overall, I think the idea is still pretty fascinating and with some development could work. The next cut Covenant vehicle was actually the Command Shuttle, which was basically a cut flying ship from Halo 2. It actually has a lot of really interesting backstory to it. It was designed and fully modeled for the purpose of Halo 2's Milestone 1 levels. In particular, the level Assault. Basically, in that level, the craft would be parked on top of a Forerunner tower where players would have the objective of destroying the ship through a variety of means, including a marine assault, airstrikes, or even using a raid. The level of damage on the ship would determine the alert level of the nearby Covenant forces, overall adding to the cut stealth mechanic of the level. I think in terms of design, I think the overall design of this shuttle is very interesting, with a lot of pieces taking inspiration from the Spirit in Halo CE, with even a new color scheme being different from basically a lot of the Covenant vehicles look like, with more of a blackish look. Luckily though, this version of the Command Shuttle was recovered later on by the Dig-Site crew when they actually released the Milestone 1 levels, though in this version you can't actually play it, but it's still pretty cool that's on the map. And eventually in the Dig-Site demo level for Halo CE, it was also put in as well. I'm assuming similar to other cut vehicles from Halo 2, it was used as a base. Its cockpit is actually facing forward like the Spirit, and it is actually fully playable and flyable in that level as well, which is pretty fascinating. Now, this version of the Command Shuttle was actually not the end of the story, as later on the Command Shuttle still progressed in development, as Bungie, even though they scrapped this version they made in the Milestone 1 levels, decided to start over completely in design. Eventually, the idea was basically reconceptualized by Eddie Smith and turned into more of a Covenant-like design, similar to other Covenant vehicles. This version of the Command Shuttle actually appeared in early storyboards for Halo 2, mainly in the mission where the Arbiter and the Elites were dropped off on Threshold to take out the Heretics. It eventually would appear in the epilogue at the end of the mission. After this, some further progress was made as a very primitive model block out was actually made for it, with the design looking oddly similar to the Lich that we got from 343 in Halo 4. But sadly though, as we all know, this vehicle never made it to the final game and was just mainly replaced by an already developed asset like the Phantoms. For my overall thoughts on this Command Shuttle, I think that the design is honestly pretty cool. I think that this version of it definitely feels more of a Covenant look and feel to it and fits more with their overall fleet. And well, that was the interesting cut history of the Lost Covenant Shuttle from Halo 2. The next cut Covenant vehicle that we're supposed to get was actually Ghost Variants. It was actually mentioned in early design documents for Halo 2 that actually had some really cool and interesting ideas for them. In the documents, they mentioned plans for a ghost called an Excavation Ghost, alongside a VTOL and a Special Forces Ghost variants as well. This concept though looks like it didn't have much development put into it, as it was only mentioned in some design documents, and it was cut from Halo 2 early on. If I had to guess what these ghosts might have looked like, I'm assuming that the Excavation Ghost might have been something like a Heretic Ghost, and maybe the Special Forces Ghost maybe would have been similar to the color scheme of some of the Special Forces guys in the Covenant Empire. Overall though, I think that this idea is really fascinating. I think that honestly it should be revived and put into more detail in a future Halo game. And I guess you can say the idea was sort of revived with skins of the ghosts coming out in future games as well. The next cut Covenant ship that was cut from Halo 2 was actually the Covenant Light Ship, or the Bridge Ship, or the Airbus in some situation. The idea behind this ship, the light ship so to speak, just as the name suggests, was basically to form light bridges for Covenant forces trying to cross a chasm into enemy territory. It would fly into the middle of the chasm, hover then on each side, extend out the light bridges to each side, and then allow the forces to cross over. The early development of this ship included the fact that the idea for the ship was actually concepted by Shin Kong Wang at Bungie, with it debuting first off in the Milestone 1 level Assault, where players would have to cross it to get into the base to attack the Command Shuttle in that lost Milestone 1 level. In the level, basically, you have to use a lot of stealth, and there was also an alert system that Bungie wanted to add as well. And players would also have to cross this light ship as well. To actually proceed and get into the base in that level, you actually would have had to cross the light ship. And the mechanic of this light ship would have been very fascinating, especially in connection to the stealth system that was also in this level as well. Essentially, most likely, you would have had to use stealth to basically cross over the light bridge, depending on the situation. If Covenant forces did detect you at some point, the light bridge would have been deactivated and you would have fell to your death. In terms of design, I do overall like the Lightship, with having a more of a sleek Covenant design to it, and also a nice purple finish to it. And despite the fact that there was actually a lot of progress put into this ship with tons of concept art made for it, and even an early blockout model for the ship found in the files for the map, and it eventually being released and kind of finished later on thanks to the dig site team releasing it as part of the Milestone 1 Assault map. Sadly though, as we all know, the ship never made it to the final game. It was cut alongside many other elements from those Milestone 1 levels, which were mainly meant for prototyping and testing out elements for the final game. Regardless though, the idea for this ship never made it past those levels. Still though, there is sort of a happy ending to this, as it was sort of canonized in the Halo universe, mainly in the book Halo Oblivion as the CPV in that story. Overall, that was the cut Lightship from Halo 2. I think it's honestly a pretty cool ship, and I wish it would have made playable and made it to the final game, as there's a lot of purposes it could have served in the campaign and story. Overall, though, it's kind of a shame we never got to see it. Another sort of cut vehicle that was cut from Halo 2 on the Covenant side of things was actually the variants of the Shadow. Now, the Shadow did make it to the final version of the game, but did you know there was actually supposed to be tons of variants for it? The vehicle in the main game shows up only in the level outskirts. We're basically carrying ghosts inside the vehicle, but there was actually a lost cut version of it that actually had the ability to carry troops into battle. This variant of the Shadow is basically the same as it is in the final game, but the only difference is that in the middle there's a sort of hovering line of seats where the troops would sit on, with even some animations for the Covenant using it as well, but a lot of it not finished. This variant of the Shadow is actually found in the Halo 2 shared map files by modders in the MCC. It was also shown in the Halo 2 manual as well for the game. And also in the Halo 2 Anniversary, weirdly, it also made it to the files in that game as well, fully rendered, which is honestly pretty fascinating. And this variant of the Shadow actually did get released by the dig site team, fully playable in the game, despite the fact that some of the animations for the City Now Covenant characters in the seat not finished. Other variants of this vehicle were also supposed to be in the game. Early design documents also mentioned the idea of an excavation Shadow, but it looks like not much work was put into it. This was most likely just a heretic version of that vehicle. Overall, for my thoughts on these Shadow variants, I think overall they make a lot of sense. I think it's logical to have a troop transporting Shadow, as I think it would have given more character to the vehicle, and it's already just mostly complete. I mean, why not put it in the anniversary version of Halo 2 anyway? Luckily though, thanks to modders, we did get to see what this version would have looked like in the Halo 2 game, so that's pretty cool. The next cut Covenant ship that we have here is kind of similar to the previous one, which was actually a variant type. This time around though for the Phantom in Halo 2, but this time around this variant would include door gunners added to the side of it. It's kind of a small detail, but actually this version of the Phantom didn't even appear into Halo 3. It was originally supposed to be appearing in Halo 2. Actually, a fully workable version of this variant was made for the E3 2003 demo for Halo 2, and in many early storyboards also showcase this variant as well, but ultimately it was never put into the final game, most likely due to the fact that the game was so rushed in terms of its development and also time constraints. Luckily though, later on, the dig site team did recover this variant of the Phantom and did release it back into the game. Overall, for my thoughts on this variant of the Phantom, even though it's a pretty small and minuscule detail so to speak, it's honestly kind of amazing that we could have got this version of Halo 2, and I'm still really happy that it made it to other games like in Halo 3 and basically became commonplace after. Still though, it's fascinating that this version of the Phantom we could have saw in Halo 2. Whew, overall that was some of the major cut vehicles and ships from Halo 2, a pretty huge amount ranging from original vehicles to even variants. Still though, it was a huge amount of cut content that we never got to see in the final game. And even though we've already covered so many cut vehicles from Halo 2, I'm sure in the future modders and some other people in the community will be able to find out more and discover even more lost content. Overall though, that was all of the major cut vehicles and ships from Halo 2. Still really cool and fascinating. Now let's get into all of the major cut weapons from Halo 2. Some of them are actually really fascinating and also surprised me. It could have changed the gameplay in a lot of ways, or even Halo history. Regardless though, let's get into the cut weapons, starting out first with the human weapons. First off, the first human weapon that we'll discuss here that was cut from Halo 2 was actually the flamethrower, a weapon that was mysteriously absent from the final game. Reason now is that it was actually just cut from the final game. The flamethrower in the first Halo was honestly very difficult to model and build according to Bungie, and while the flamethrower never actually made it to the Xbox version, it would eventually make it to the Halo Combat Evolved version on the PC. So going into the second game, they wanted to redesign it and make it better, and also make it more available for everybody. Like many of Halo 2's elements, the flamethrower was completely redesigned, featuring the iconic shark-like face and the panels on the front. And Bungie actually did make it pretty far along in development for this weapon as well, having it modeled, rendered, and gameplay shooting out fire as well. It was shown in the behind the scenes doc for Halo 2 and also a few release screenshots as well. Sadly though, as we all know, it was cut from the final game. The most likely reason for its cancellation was most likely likely just because they could not fix all the issues that naturally came with the flamethrower. Issues like the fact that a lot of the physics surrounding the flamethrower would have been difficult to properly implement in Halo 2's engine. Also the fact too, just you have a lot of balancing issues when it comes to the flamethrower. This was especially an issue with the original Halo Combat Evolved flamethrower. Still though, at the end of the day, the flamethrower was ultimately scrapped. Now the legacy of this flamethrower was not forgotten, as Bungie would eventually release the flamethrower in Halo 3, with the design of it in Halo 3 pretty much being the same one as it was designed in Halo 2. And as far as I can see in some of the gameplay for Halo 2's flamethrower, it pretty much plays the same as the Halo 3's flamethrower. And later on, the Diggside team did release Halo 2's flamethrower in-game, but it was not really usable and needed to be fixed really thanks to modding. Overall though, that was the interesting story of Halo 2's flamethrower. I think it's very fascinating that it was originally supposed to be in Halo 2, but overall I'm kind of indifferent to it as Halo 3's flamethrower is kind of whatever to me, and this looks like it was pretty much going to be the same version. Still though, it's a fascinating piece of lost content. The next cut human weapon in Halo 2 were actually flashbang grenades. It was mentioned in early design documents for Halo 2 with its purpose of stunning enemies, but obviously not dealing the same damage as frag grenades. Eventually though, it seemed like that these flashbang grenades did not make it past the early development stage. Most likely got cut due to the resources not being available, and also maybe just due to the fact that that cut stealth system was also cut out of the final game, which obviously these grenades would have contributed to. Still though, I think that the flashbang grenades in Halo 2 were a really interesting idea. The next cut human weapon in Halo 2 was actually the general purpose machine gun, or the GPMG, or just that machine gun that you have in Halo 2. Now, it was pretty fascinating when you played Halo 2's campaign, as this machine gun was basically the only fixed turn in the game for the player to use, but you can never attach it or use it or carry it with you. But did you know originally in Halo 2, that was actually supposed to be the case? Yep, you would be able to rip it off its turn and use it as a first-person weapon in the final game. And overall, this version of the machine gun was actually found thanks to modders, and it's actually pretty complete, even with firing, reload animations being put into it as well, with even an alternate model of the machine gun with no buttstock and removable magazines was made as well. It was actually discovered in the files of the final build of Halo 2 with some strings of codes referencing to the machine gun being able to be picked up and used. Eventually though, in Halo 2 on the MCC on the PC version, the machine gun was added to the game's shared directory, allowing it to be spawned and being used in the game via modding. So with this weapon pretty much being mostly complete and was found in the files of the game, why was it actually cut? Well, no reason has been given for sure, but it was most likely cut just due to the fact that they probably just didn't have enough time to make it fully work in the game with the physics and also the balancing issues that would have came alongside the thing in the gameplay. Now, like mentioned, this machine gun was found thanks to modding, and it's actually been playable for quite a while thanks to mods, but also you can play it in the Halo 2 Uncut mod by Vengeful Van Dam, which honestly I highly recommend. Overall, I love this version of the machine gun that we could have gotten in Halo 2, with it in moments being a little broken, sure, and unbalanced, but honestly just truly amazing at the same time. Obviously though, later on we all know that this idea of the machine gun being used in Halo games was later repurposed in Halo 3, but this time around in third person where you pick up the gun, which is still a pretty cool idea. The next cut human weapon that was cut from Halo 2 was actually a variant of the GP machine gun in Halo 2, but of course having a grenade launcher attached to it. It would have been able to shoot 20 to 25mm grenades at enemies. It seemed like progress on this weapon actually made it pretty far in the development, as a full-on model was developed for the game, and honestly it looks pretty cool. With major differences of this model compared to the version like the machine gun that we got in the final game is one, we have a huge magazine underneath the machine gun, probably carrying all the grenades, with the belts of machine ammo feeding into the side of it. Now for some backstory with this weapon. Bungie actually was pretty interested in this variant of the machine gun. It actually showed up at some early concept art for Halo 2, and eventually Bungie decided to develop it further with having a fully rendered model in the game with animations. Sadly though, as the first person variant of the machine gun was cut as well, this grenade variant was also cut, most likely just due to balancing issues and not having enough time to fix all the issues in King. Later on though, the Diggside team would recover this variant and become available thanks to modding in the game, which overall I think this variant is really cool, and I think it's a kind of neat variation on the machine gun. The next cut human weapon that was cut from the game was actually the Silence SMG, which honestly was pretty surprising to me that this was originally supposed to appear all the way back in Halo 2. The model for this weapon was basically a standard SMG from Halo 2, but with a silencer put on the barrel, even having a unique sound and particle effects completed with it as well. Sadly though, in the rush to complete the game, it seemed like that this weapon was cut, most likely due to the fact that the whole cut stealth mechanic of Halo 2 was already scrapped, so in effect this weapon got scrapped as well. Luckily though, this weapon wouldn't stay dead forever, as later on in the Windows Vista release of Halo 2, the weapon was actually put into the game, specifically on the map Example. And from what I can see of the Vista's version of the Silence SMG, the gameplay of it looks pretty cool and solid. Eventually though, as we all know, the weapon was brought back in force for Halo 3 ODST, where the weapon debuted debuted alongside the many new stealth elements in that game, where honestly the Silenced SMG worked the best in that environment. And later on in the release of Halo 2 on PC for the MCC, the weapon was actually added thanks to modding, and honestly it's really cool that it got restored. And overall, that was the Silenced SMG that we could have got from Halo 2. I think it's really fascinating that we could have got this version in Halo 2, and even though, like I said, we did kind of get it with Halo 2 Vista in a sort of way, I think it's really fascinating we could have had all these stealth weapons and a whole stealth system that we just never got to see in the original Halo 2 game. Still though, it's pretty fascinating. The next cut weapon we have here is actually the EMP Mine. It was actually a briefly discussed weapon mentioned in the Halo 2 design docs for the game in very early development. Basically, the mine would have caused a reaction causing all electronics to die, similar to what an EMP usually does in movies and entertainment. This idea was actually never pursued that much in development though. It's probably just a huge amount of gameplay mechanics that would have been required to actually make this thing work. Just could not have been possible. Just the development time alone caused this thing just to be scrapped from the final game. Still, the fact that the EMP mine was considered for Halo 2 is pretty crazy. It's pretty fascinating. The next cut weapon from Halo 2 that was human related was actually the Gravity Rifle. This was the weapon cut early on in Halo 2's development. The rifle was actually a cut Halo Combat Evolved weapon that made it pretty far in development before being cut. It was mentioned in the early design documents for Halo 2 before it was also cut early on. Not much to be said about this one. The next cut weapon from Halo 2 was actually a really early concept of explosive charges and mines, which are actually considered for Halo 2 early on in development. Satchel charges, explosives, and mines were mentioned in the early design documents for Halo 2, but sadly as it seems it was cut early on by Bungie. And even though no specific reason was given for its cancellation, I most likely speculate that the resources needed to make this mechanic work in the game, which probably would have included tons of destructible environments and physics that would have needed to be added to the final game, would just kind of made it impossible to be added, especially given the hardware limitations on the Xbox and the Bungie's already stretched out resources in making the game. Weirdly, later on, the satchel charges and explosives would have small cameos in the Halo universe. Obviously first in the art piece by Lawrence McLeese, where Chief is surrounded by tons of weapons that he would used in the games, including the satchel charges, as well as hinting at their existence as well and confirming it. Overall though, I think the idea of Halo having explosives in the gameplay, it really could have shooken things up and honestly would have been amazing, but just I can totally see why it was cut from Halo 2, just simply all the resources that would have required it to make it possible in game. Still though, overall, explosives in Halo would have been lit. Now that we've actually covered most of the human weapons that were cut from Halo 2, now let's get into the major cut Covenant weapons from Halo 2. So let's get into it. The first cut weapon from the Covenant for Halo 2 that we'll discuss is actually called the Brute Grenade. They were grenades that were intended to be used by brutes in battle. Some development on these weapons were done with design docs being drawn up, with the overall design being influenced majorly by incendiary grenades in the Halo universe. It included spikes near the top of the grenade and also would have stuck on enemies and possibly exploded or also been on fire as a result. Either way though, a lot of development was put into it with even a 3D model built into the game, but later on though they were cut from the final release. Possibly the reason for this was with the team at Bungie not being able to fully finalize it before the final release of the game. And despite these grenades never making it to the final game, these grenades would in spirit appear in a different form, so to speak, with the spike grenades in Halo 3 that we have today, which are honestly pretty cool and honestly would have just probably serve the same purpose as the Brute Grenades. And even later on, the DigSci team would actually release the Brute Grenade officially in one of their mods later on, finally giving access to people who wanted to experience the lost Brute Grenade from Halo 2. Overall, I think the design is pretty cool, and even though this is basically just an early version of the Spike Grenade, at least in Halo 2, I honestly think it's a pretty cool idea and wish it made it into the Halo 2 game. The next cut Covenant weapon that we have here is actually called the Blam-Mite Harpoon, which funny enough was actually a cut weapon from Halo Combat Evolved. But it seemed as the development of Halo 2 progressed, the idea of bringing it back possibly as a Covenant weapon started to appear, with even Blam-Mites as the harpoons on the weapon. Quick side note, Blam-Mites are actually those pink crystals for the needlers you see in Halo, just if you didn't know. This cut weapon was actually mentioned in Halo 2 design docs briefly, with even the multiplayer lead Max Hermelman professing his love for the old cut Halo Combat Evolved weapon and probably wanted to bring it into Halo 2. Sadly though, not much development was actually put into this weapon, as no models were able to be made for it, and pretty much it was being cut early on in development. Overall, I like this cut weapon and this variation of the harpoon. I mean, I liked it back when it was a cut weapon for Halo Combat Evolved, and I kind of wish it made it into Halo 2. Regardless, still pretty interesting. So we have this pretty insane Covenant version of the flamethrower that was cut from Halo 2. This weapon was called the Disintegrator, which honestly, just from the name alone, sounds amazing. It was featured in a beta build of Halo 2 and eventually was released later on by the Digside team thanks to modding. The current model of it though, as it's released in its standard state, is actually untextured and could spew fire in the game though, which is honestly pretty cool. Interesting though, from a third person perspective, it looks like it can also spew out red fire plasma of some sorts, which is honestly pretty cool. The weapon also would have had a reticle attached to it with some unfinished cooldown bar below it as well for some of the mechanics of the weapon. Even in the Halo 2 Vista release, modders found in the code some sound effects for the weapon as well, just to show that a lot of development was actually put into this weapon. But sadly, despite all the development and work that was put into this weapon, despite all the progress that was made, it was ultimately unfinished and cut from the final game. Bungie most likely did this due to all the time constraints just in the process of making that game, which is honestly a true shame as I really love this weapon. I mean, I think the idea of having a Covenant flamethrower, or sort of equivalent to the human flamethrower, is honestly amazing and would have been a great mechanic added to the whole Halo sandbox. And also just would have added more character to the brutes and given more lore to their side and the faction as a whole. Honestly, regardless, the Disintegrator is amazing and hopefully one day it makes its final release in a Halo game. The next weapon we have here is actually a weapon called the Plasma Mortar. This was actually an early cut Covenant weapon based on a knee mortar from World War II, and mainly a continuation of the Gravity Winch from Halo Combat Evolved, which was also a cut weapon in that game as well. It seemed like in the development of Halo 2, many cut ideas from Halo Combat Evolved were reintroduced into Halo 2's development, including that cut weapon, the Gravity Winch. But this time around for Halo 2, it was actually turned into a Covenant weapon with plasma used as the projectile. Some development was put into this with a rough 3D model made for it, but no textures or solidified surfaces were put onto it, and past this, nothing else came from the weapon as it seemed like it was cut early on in development. Overall, I think this weapon would have been nice, and I think it's a shame that we never got to see it in Halo 2. I mean, the idea of having a classic style mortar in a Halo game just sounds sick. The next Covenant weapon we have here, believe it or not, and to my surprise as well, was actually the plasma turret. Similar to the machine gun from the human side, you're actually supposed to take off the plasma turret from its stands and use it as a complete first-person weapon. This cut weapon even had a first-person model attached to it with animations for firing included as well. Also, I wanted to mention that the fast rate of fire with the plasma is also pretty insane, as there's really no cooldown time, and I could definitely see how unbalanced this thing would have been. Overall, despite the fact that there was a lot of work put into it seemed like Bungie just never intended to be put into the final game, most likely just due to balancing issues, or maybe just due to time constraints. Overall, I think that the plasma turret was a really cool cut weapon from Halo 2 that I honestly wish made it to the final game. Even though it's completely unbalanced, I think it's really fun to play. Luckily though, in mods like Halo 2 Uncut, and thanks also to the Digside team and great modders like the Vengeful Van Damme, it was added back into the game somewhat, so honestly you have your chance to play it. Overall, this was a sick weapon we never got to see. One of the major weapons that were cut from Halo 2's development was actually the usable Jackal Energy Sword. Yep, I know it's crazy. It actually made it pretty far in development, with even having a workable version usable by modders in the game. How this lost weapon would have actually functioned in the game is in most situations you would have grabbed the energy sword and it would have been held in the left hand, and in the right hand you would have held a small secondary weapon for defense like a plasma pistol or a magnum. And basically in gameplay, the shield would have essentially acted like a riot shield from Call of Duty, providing some much needed cover from enemies and from those goddamn cursed Jackal snipers. In most gameplay scenarios, how you've been able to get the shield most likely would have been if you killed a Jackal, you would have been able to collect it from them, or if you killed one of those flood carrier forms that was carrying it, which would also cut enemies from Halo 2, you'll have been able to collect them as well during the gameplay. For the weapon's origin, early ideas were conceived by animator John Bookness, if I said that name correctly, around the early 2003 period of Halo 2's development in these pages of sketches, basically showing early ideas of what the shield been able to do. This included the idea of it being able to collect energy from weapons being fired at it and basically shoot it back at its attackers. Also, alternate animations for the shield were thought of as well, and the idea of the Jackal shield being able to form some kind of drop shield around the player was also thought of as well, kind of similar to the drop shield ability that we eventually got in Halo Reach. Now, most of these were just proposed things for the Jackal energy shield and still were just very early ideas and never made into serious development, but still overall these ideas are just truly insane and honestly incredible. I love these ideas. Later on, development for this cut weapon seemed like it was progressing pretty well, as even though we never got most of those early ideas, the Jackal shield was actually made into a workable model and animations were done for it. But ultimately though, sadly, it never made it to the final build of Halo 2. It seemed like the most reason why behind its cancellation was just most likely due to balancing issues, and maybe just also due to time constraints for Halo 2's development, causing the cancellation of this lost weapon. Luckily though, like mentioned, thanks to modders, it's actually now playable in the game thanks to mods like Halo 2 Uncut and thanks to awesome modders in the community. And overall, I love the idea of the Jackal Energy Shield being an actual usable weapon in gameplay. Honestly sounds like a great idea. I think it's kind of a common giveaway for it just being so, but honestly it was a true shame that this never made it to the final game, especially with those proposed ideas and abilities from early ideas of this weapon. Just sound truly insane and honestly would have been amazing for Halo 2. Still though, overall it's a pretty fascinating cut weapon. Well, that was all the major cut weapons that I wanted to mention from Halo 2. Now let's get into the other faction, which is the Forerunners and all of their lost weapons for Halo 2. Now, there's not as many weapons when it comes to the Forerunners, but I still wanted to mention them. The first of these was actually the Sentinel Needler. This was actually a cut Forerunner weapon from Halo 2 that was basically the Sentinel beam, but it would be able to shoot out red needles, similar to the projectile shot out by the Enforcers, and also the Needlers in Halo 2. The weapon, believe it or not, was built and thanks to modders was actually realized in the final game, but it was ultimately cut from the final build of Halo 2, as variants of Sentinel Beam and that whole concept was basically cut from the overall game. In the files of Halo 2 Vista, modders are actually able to find the crosshair and weapon pickup icons for it as well, so it seemed like the idea did make it pretty far along in development at some point. But Bungie scrapped the whole variation system, probably just not to confuse the player overall. The next variant that got cut from the final game was actually the weapon called Sentinel Beam Grenade Launcher, and the files of Halo 2 Vista even had its own crosshair and weapon pickup icons as well. The final cut variant from the game was actually a weapon called the Sentinel Enforcer Charged Bolt, which unlike the other variants, there's really not much as known about this weapon. There were crosshair and weapon pickup icons, but they were only assumed and not actually confirmed to be leaked in the files. And to be honest with you, there's just not much known about the weapon for sure, as it's not really for sure why it was cut or why it was actually put in there. Luckily though, all of these variants of the Sentinel Beam are actually available thanks to modders and some mods for the game, and honestly, I think the overall variant system for the Sentinel Beam, despite some of the kooky ones like the grenade launcher, overall sounds like a really great idea, and it's kind of a shame that we never got to see it in future Halo games. It's kind of cool it was considered a cut and a lost element for Halo 2. Now for this section of the weapons video, I want to mention some smaller random bits of cut weapons that really don't have much context being here, but I still wanted to mention. The first of these is called the Shredder. We also have another one called the Sniper Rod, and finally we even have the pike that some of the Honor Guard used in the final game, usable now thanks to mods. And at some point, all these weapons were actually mentioned in the early design docs for Halo 2 and some early ideas, but sadly just not much was made in terms of development or even in terms of details about these weapons, besides the actual pikes, which did make it to the game but only with the brutes. Another smaller cut feature was actually the original version of the BR rifle in Halo 2, which in the final game was basically a 3-round burst rifle, but in the original game, especially in that E3 demo from 2003, it was actually just a single shot weapon, but it was really changed further on in development, most likely due to balancing issues. Still though, I think that the original weapon is honestly pretty cool, and it was released by the Digside team, so if you want to give it a try, go ahead. Whew, and overall, that was all the major cut weapons that were cut from Halo 2. A lot of them are honestly really cool and should have been in the final game, while some of them were just quite unnecessary. I'm sure I missed a lot of cut weapons that were never made it to the final game, but I just wanted to mention all the ones that I was able to discover and all the major ones I felt worth mentioning. Overall, this was a really fascinating deep dive into some lost weapons from the final version of Halo 2. So that was all the major cut content from Halo 2 that I wanted to mention. With a huge amount of it, and even with me just covering so much material, I'm sure there's plenty of things that I might have missed, as Halo 2 was just so ambitious in scope, and arguably had even more cut content that we're even discovering to this day, especially compared to other games in the franchise. And I really found a lot of enjoyment just looking at this lost content for Halo 2. A lot of new information that really surprised me, and honestly just shows what kind of game Halo 2 could have been. Overall though, if you liked the video of me covering all of the major content from Halo 2 and you want to see more, just please subscribe, comment, any kind of support really does help, and hopefully y'all have a good day. Peace, and always remember with Halo 2, finish the fight.